Chapter 13. Unbelievable. The next morning, Azil caught up with Voda, who went out early to catch more bugs with the Acton barometer. "This is impossible," said Voda, throwing her hands into the air. "How am I supposed to catch anything in this wind? This is nothing. Wait until later." "Later, what do you mean? Do you think the weather is going to get worse?" "Yes," said Azil, pacing back and forth. "A major storm is coming and everyone in the village is in danger." Voda shrugged. "What do you mean in danger? We've had bad storms before, but nothing dangerous. Trust me." Azil stopped pacing temporarily and stared at her friend. "This one is going to be bad, really bad." "How are you so sure about this?" Azil awkwardly paused for a moment to consider how to best explain what she had done. "Okay, yesterday afternoon after I left your house, I did something. Can you be more specific?" "Something really crazy." "Az, what did you do?" "Remember that fit I told you about, the one who I saw climb up into the trees?" "Don't tell me you went up there too." "I had to." Voda's eyes grew wide. "What, so you did? You actually went up there? Have you lost it?" "I needed to know what was going on up there. And I had to find out who that stranger was. That was the stupidest thing you've ever done. And that's saying a lot." Voda walked around Azil, analyzing her from head to toe. "You seem to be okay?" She paused and gently put a hand on Azil's shoulder. "You weren't attacked or anything?" Azil took a step back and crossed her arms. "No, I wasn't attacked. Nothing like that." "Well, what did you do up there?" "I told you I went up there because I was searching for that strange fid." "And did you find this mysterious tree-climbing stranger?" "Yes, he's a middy like us." Voda's jaw dropped. "Seriously? You actually found someone up in the trees?" "I sure did." "What was he doing up there? He lives up there." Voda crossed her arms and stared at Azil. "He lives up there? That makes no sense," she said, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, fids do not live in trees." Azil grinned. "You're wrong. This one does. He's got his own house and everything." "A middy with his own house in a tree?" Voda tilted her head to one side. "Az, are you serious?" "I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. The important thing is what he told me about the storm." "And you think you can trust this guy?" Voda asked, narrowing her eyes. "Yes, he's really smart. And he wanted to warn me to warn us about the storm that's coming." "You really believe him, don't you?" "He was kind of strange, but I don't think he'd have any reason to lie about something like this." "Well, if he's telling the truth, then we need to do something." Voda turned and started to walk away. "Hey, where are you going?" "I need to tell my father." Azil ran and grabbed Voda by the shoulder, spinning her back around. "No, you can't tell him." Voda's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "What do you mean I can't tell my father?" "You just can't. Azil, this doesn't make any sense. If this storm is going to be as bad as you say, my father needs to know. He will later. Please promise me you won't tell him anything yet, at least not until after you've met Lucas." "Lucas? Who's Lucas?" "He's the middy who lives up in the trees." "You expect me to go up there?" "No way." "But you have to. I still can't believe you went up there. You were lucky the Groken didn't get you." Voda took another close look at Azil's body. "It doesn't look like you got the nash. You know, you're really lucky." Azil threw her hands up. "Stop it. There's no holobial nash in the vicious Groken. Doesn't exist either. It's all made up." "What do you mean made up? I've heard the Groken with my own ears." "How do you explain that?" "What we've been hearing all these years, it's not what we thought. It's actually a really amazing machine that Lucas made. He says it produces some kind of sound he calls music. That doesn't make any sense. Everyone in our village has been hearing those horrifying sounds for generations, certainly longer than some MIDI has been around." "You're right. It doesn't make sense. A lot of what I heard and saw up there doesn't make sense." Voda stepped back. "Why do I get the feeling there's a lot more you aren't telling me?" "Because a lot of what I discovered are things you're not going to want to hear." "Why me? What does it have to do with me?" Azil turned her head and looked down at the ground. "Well, not you specifically. It has more to do with your father." "My father? What does some strange middy in the trees know about my father?" "Lucas is not strange, and he seems to know more about your father than anyone, including you." "How is that possible?" "Though there are some things about Lucas I still haven't told you. He was once a member of our society, a long time ago." Voda narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean, a long time? I don't remember anyone with that name." Azil put hands on Voda's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "No, I mean a long, long time, much longer than we've been here. Lucas is not like us. Not like any of us. You know how we are supposed to north after 36 years?" Voda nodded. Well, he told me he's been around for way longer than that. Voda shook her head. Well, he's lying. He has to be lying. Aze, you know how crazy this sounds. I know it sounds crazy. I didn't believe it either. Then he showed me this thing. It was a machine with moving images from a long time ago. It showed strange-looking creatures walking upright, kind of like us, except they were made of water or something. Voda shrugged. What does this have to do with us? Everything. Because apparently those creatures were us. This doesn't make any sense. If any of this was true, my dad would have told us about it. I would have known. Yes, your dad should have told us about this. What I discovered, everyone in this village needs to know. Are you saying my father knew about all this? But never told us. Yes, unfortunately, that's exactly what I'm saying. If he knows, why hasn't he mentioned any of this? Azil frowned as she looked at the confusion in her best friend's eyes. There's something he told me about your father. Though you're not going to want to hear this, but you've got to know the truth. I'm your friend, that's why I need to tell you this. Lucas told me your father has been keeping the truth from everyone so he can make Zovia into his own perfect society, a place that's all about him. Voda took a step back. Aze, this is just mean. Who is this Lucas? Anyway, he doesn't know anything about my father. She angrily turned away from Azil and crossed her arms. Have you ever wondered why this place is called Zovia? No, said Voda, shrugging uncomfortably. What does that have to do with anything? Zovia, it's from your father's name, Lazov. Voda turned around and narrowed her eyes. His name has nothing to do with Zovia? Our world has been called Zovia for a lot longer than he's been around. You don't get it. Though your father has never left, said Azil, shaking her head. Aze, what are you talking about? Lucas isn't the only one whose cycle goes on forever. Your father's the same way. You know how stupid that sounds, right? I can't believe that you, of all fids, are gullible enough to believe this insanity. Voda turned to walk away, rubbed her head, and turned back toward Azil. Wait, I know what's going on here. Did you go out into the blindness again? Oh, now this makes sense, she said, laughing. The blindness was playing tricks on your mind. There's no such thing as blindness. That was another lie your father made up. He made up a bunch of lies to keep us from discovering the truth. Voda clenched her fists as she stepped closer. Stop. Stop calling my dad a liar. I can't believe you are choosing to believe this middy, who you just met, over my father, who you've known your whole life. I'm done listening to this. Voda slammed the Acton barometer to the ground and stomped away, leaving Azil alone in the swamp as rain began to fall. Chapter 14. Fiak Day. The morning after her argument with Voda brought intense rain. Stepping out the front door of her house, Azil was immediately reminded of Lucas's warning. She shielded her eyes from the falling rain as she looked around the village. This does not look good, she thought. All through the night the wind had gradually gotten stronger, and now there were large growth leaves scattered throughout the village. Azil tilted her head back to look toward the sky. She noticed that the tops of the groaks were swaying slightly and the green glow wasn't nearly as vivid as it had been on the previous day. Taking her first step, she heard a familiar sloshing sound. Azil looked down to see mud rising up between the cracks in her toes. As she continued to walk, she quickly realized the entire village must now be completely saturated. There were numerous indications this storm was unlike any Azil had ever seen, and she knew this was only the beginning. She wanted to warn everyone, but how could she when the only fig she could talk to, and who took her seriously, wasn't even speaking to her? As she walked around the village, Azil noticed several different reactions to the weather. Noobs seemed to be enjoying the experience, throwing mud and sliding around on the wet ground. Not surprisingly, very few middies were anywhere to be seen. Azil imagined most of them didn't want the mud to mess up their lustrous bodies, which they had worked so hard to achieve. Of all the fids outside that morning, Azil could see that most of them were adults. Observing the bigs, Azil noticed they appeared to be acting stranger than normal. They have to know something's wrong, she thought. They have to know this storm is going to be really bad. Most of the bigs appeared to display an unusual level of discomfort. She hoped this was an indication they were taking the storm seriously. Maybe I won't need to say anything, Azil thought. Maybe everyone will realize how bad this storm is going to get and take precautions. Deep down, she knew this was highly unlikely. She felt everyone in the village was more concerned with how they were perceived by others than by any real threat. Her suspicions were confirmed as she continued to watch their reactions. While several bigs seemed to be authentically concerned, pacing around their yards, while frantically inspecting the outside of their homes, the majority appeared to be hiding their true feelings beneath a layer of narkle. On the surface, all she could see were the normal giggles and fake smiles, while in their eyes she could sense a growing level of concern. She knew that none of them were bold enough to speak out, take charge, or initiate a plan to ensure their safety. If anyone was going to take action, she realized it would have to be her. Azil paced back and forth as she continued to observe the fids around the village. Why do I always have to be the downer? She thought, shaking her head. Before she could do anything, she noticed that Lazov had emerged from his house and was walking around anxiously. He must have been aware of the growing level of concern within the village, because he did something quite unusual even for him. He gathered everyone in the center of the village and climbed up onto the stage. Azil curiously watched as he prepared to make a speech. Finally, she thought, taking a sigh of relief, he's going to act like a leader. Lazov is actually going to do something positive for a change. She listened closely as he gave his announcement. Attention, my fiddle-dee-diddles, Lazov said with a cheerful grin. I have a special gift I would love to share with all of you today. You all look like you could use a nice big dose of arfy-diddle-dee-narkle. All the fids in the village cheered with delight, but Azil did not cheer. What? She thought, narrowing her eyes. Lazov quickly raised his arms in the air, quieting the crowd. I declare the remainder of this glorious day to be Fiak Day. Hearing this, Azil's jaw dropped. Fiak Day? Are you kidding me? While everyone in the village cheered, she looked around at their jubilant faces in disbelief. What are you all cheering about? She thought. This is not something to celebrate. Azil looked around frantically for anyone who wasn't cheering, anyone who might understand what an absolutely horrible idea this was. This is bad, really bad, she thought, realizing what a negative effect this would have on her efforts to warn everyone about the storm. Over the years, Azil had watched as Lazov would gather everyone together on a random day and proceed to declare it one of several ridiculous days he had made up. There was Nulaki Day, when all the fids had to keep their eyes closed and feel their way around the village. And Scramcram Day, which Azil really hated. On that particular day, Lazov would pick a random house in the village and shove every last fid inside, where they would all stand shoulder to shoulder for an entire day. And there were others, like Blark, Alark, Go Bye Day, and Groken Shaky Day, when everyone would go around shaking trees, hoping to annoy the Groken. In the past, Azil had always thought of these unusual village activities as Lazov's innocent, yet annoying attempts at fun. But on that day, in that moment, it was all starting to make sense to her. Those crazy stories Lukas had told her didn't seem so crazy anymore. For the first time in her life, Azil was finally beginning to understand the motivations behind Lazov's bizarre behavior. Her eyes narrowed as she pondered this new understanding. He was using all those times to control us, our thoughts, our actions, our attitudes. And today he's using Fiat Day to limit our ability to communicate. Azil slowly shook her head in disbelief. Lazov wants to completely silence and delegitimize everyone's fears about the storm. Azil had experienced numerous Fiat Days in her life, which she usually spent hiding out in her workshop. The idea of spending the entire day having to replace every noun she said with Blark and every verb with Fiak seemed completely pointless. But on this day, it was not only pointless, it was dangerous. It was clear to Azil that Fiak Day would disrupt any attempt for her or anyone else to make plans for their survival. She knew Lazov must have a reason for what he was doing, but nothing made sense. Why is he doing this? She wondered. All this can't be about keeping everyone from complaining about the storm. Azil continued to think as she wiped droplets of water from her face. Suddenly, her eyes widened as she was struck by another possibility. He doesn't know. Lazov thinks this is just going to blow over. But if this is as bad as Lukas said, Azil clenched her eyes shut. She didn't even want to imagine what might happen. As she stood in the rain and watched the insanity begin to unfold, it all made sense. Her hope of everyone taking action against the storm suddenly evaporated as she heard the roar of firearks and blarks spreading throughout the village. Watching Lazov's satisfied expression, another startling possibility struck Azil. Could it be possible? Does he know? Is this about the storm, or is this really about me? Does Lazov know that I know the truth? Azil realized with everything going on, she was probably just getting paranoid. I can't worry about what he knows or doesn't know. She glanced around the village for a solution, a clue to point her in the right direction. I need to figure out a way to warn everyone about this storm. They need to realize it's not going away. They need to understand this thing's going to get a lot worse. But how could she possibly warn everyone without being allowed to use real words? Chapter 15. The Downer Crown. Later that morning, the wind and rain had intensified. Azil couldn't remember the last time she saw wind strong enough to cause the enormous groaks to lean, even slightly, to one side. Small puddles were forming everywhere, and the rising wetlands were beginning to overflow into the village. By this time, Azil had thought of an idea, a way to spread information about the dangerous storm. This idea would require her to defy the rules of Fayaq Day, but she could think of no other choice. There was an invention her father had made for Lazov years ago. It was designed to be used as a voice amplifier, which Lazov could have used for his announcements. Azil's father called it the voco boom. It was a hollow spiraling tube with one small end and one large end. He thought it would be a great gift for Lazov, allowing him to boost his voice so everyone could hear him better. After making and testing the voco boom, her father decided to keep it hidden in their workshop. He later explained this decision to Azil, telling her, "Lazov is not worthy of this. One day, someone will have something important to say in this village, but I doubt it will be him. In all my years, I have yet to hear him say anything of much importance." So her father's invention had sat unused in the workshop for many years. Azil realized this would be an ideal time to use it, but it would not be Lazov's voice that would be amplified. The villagers stood by, watching in confusion as Azil dragged the large awkward object through puddle after puddle on her way toward the center of the village. When she arrived at Fun Central, she pulled the voco boom up onto the stage. By this time, she had noticed that everyone's pointless blarks and fayaks had become whispers. With her father's invention carefully positioned in front of her, Azil began to shout into the small end as loud as she could. "Attention, Fids." The sound that came out of the large end completely shocked her. It was much louder than she had imagined. This startled Azil, as well as many of the onlookers. She stepped back and repositioned her mouth farther away from the small end and began to speak once again. "Attention, everyone, I have an announcement of great importance." She glanced up toward the sky, then back to the crowd. "This storm is increasing and the weather is going to get much worse. What you are experiencing now is only the beginning. The wind and rain are going to become extremely heavy over the next couple days, causing destruction unlike anything we have ever seen." Azil looked down toward the crowd and was surprised to see they were actually listening to her. "The village and everyone in it are in danger. That's why we all need to work together." Before she could finish her announcement, Lazov jumped on stage and pushed her away from the voco boom. Waving his arms in the air, he then proceeded to give his own passionate announcement. "Black, Fayaq, Fayaq, black, Fayaq, black, black." Azil realized that this might be a good moment to disappear, but before she could get off the stage, Lazov grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her backstage. Ignoring his own rules of Fayaq Day, he gave a threatening warning to Azil. "Who the black do you think you are? This is my village and I make the rules. You may think you know everything, but let me assure you, you do not. Your disobedience of Fayaq Day will not go unpunished." Lazov pointed across the village toward Azil's house. "I want you to go home." Azil turned to look at him. "That's it? That's all? You just want me to go home?" she asked, shrugging. "No, that's not all," he said, shaking his head. "There's more." From behind his back, Lazov revealed a jagged metal object in the shape of a bowl. He grinned and placed it on her head. "Because you are the biggest downer around, I present to you the downer crown." Azil sighed. She was quite familiar with this rust-covered hunk of junk. This wasn't the first time in her life she hadn't played by Lazov's crazy rules, and wearing the downer crown seemed to be his favorite punishment. Of all the things she imagined Lazov could have done, this didn't seem so bad. At first, Azil was relieved, but Lazov wasn't finished. "For the remainder of Fayaq Day, you will wear your downer crown, perched, like a bird, on the roof of your house." Staring up at Lazov, Azil's eyes grew wide. "You want me to sit on my roof? That's right, you are to sit quietly and wear this crown, like the mischievous little queen you are." "Queen, what's that?" Lazov shook his head uncomfortably. "Never mind, forget it, I just made it up." "I make things up. That's why they call me the Great Azdor." I thought it was Azdor the Ultimate." "Yes, that too." Lazov's grin quickly transformed into a scowl as he raised his arm and pointed toward Azil's house. "Your throne awaits." For a moment, Azil felt like she was listening to Lucas. She had no idea what a throne was, or if it was even a real word. She decided the smartest thing she could do is just remain silent. "Maybe this experience will teach you something like the embarrassment you have caused me with this useless blark alike of yours." Lazov kicked the voco boom, nearly knocking it off the stage. Azil clenched her fists, trying to remain calm. This was one of her father's greatest inventions, and she felt it deserved respect. "Well, what are you waiting for?" asked Lazov, pointing impatiently. "Get going." Azil wanted to say something. She wanted to tell him he was a selfish blark. She imagined kicking him like he kicked her father's invention. But she did neither. Instead, she realized her best option would be to comply with Lazov's wishes and endure public ridicule for the rest of the day. Back to her house through the mud, wind and rain she went. When she reached her yard, Azil looked up at her family's home. It wasn't very tall, and climbing on the roof was nothing new to her. What she hadn't tried is climbing in the rain. She immediately realized why she had never tried it. Her hands and feet slipped uselessly against the side of her house. This is impossible. If I can just grab the roof, thought Azil, stretching her arm out as far as it could reach. Feeling around with her left hand, she was able to find a tiny gap between two of the metal panels on the roof. Yes, she thought as she slowly began to pull herself up. Once she had managed to climb up onto the roof, she sat down on the edge and dangled her feet over the side. Azil looked back toward the center of the village, squinting her eyes to see through the rain. She was surprised to see that Lazov still hadn't left the stage. At first he appeared to be pacing around, but then he walked over to the voco boom. Azil's eyes widened as he proceeded to point directly at her. What he did next was even more shocking. Lazov immediately began shouting at her in what seemed to be a scolding manner. Black, black, black. A crowd was now beginning to gather around Azil's house. Looking up through the heavy rain, they proceeded to taunt her with a clamor of fireworks and blocks. At that moment, all she could do is sit there with her head covered by the donor crown and feel miserable. It was painful for her to see everyone taunting her when all she was trying to do was help them. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement on the roof behind her. It was her brother Morval crawling towards her. Firework, block, firework, firework, he said, looking at her seriously. Then a huge grin appeared on his face. Just kidding. Azil grabbed a loose chunk of metal from the roof and threw it at him. Curve, what are you doing up here? I just came up here to say hi to my big sister. Well, hi now, bye. Azil waved her hand toward him in a shooing motion. Seriously, get out of here before Lazov sees you. Who? Azdor, your great leader, she said, rolling her eyes. I'm not worried about him. What's he going to do? Make me wear the downer crown. Morval grinned. Too late, somebody beat me to it. Speaking of, Azil grabbed the downer crown and flipped it upside down, pouring water onto the roof. Once she put it back on top of her head, she turned toward Morval and narrowed her eyes. Tell me again why you're up here. He nodded. Mom wanted to let you know that she's not mad. Azil turned and looked down at the angry mob that had formed in her yard. That's one. Now I only have 74 fids who are mad at me. 73, Morval said, smiling. I'm not mad at you, but I do think Azdor is just a block who likes to pick on my sister. She returned the smile. That's true. And Mom agrees. Really? Yeah, she doesn't like the way Azdor treats you. And this time she thinks he's gone too far. Azil turned her head and gazed off into the rain. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mother, the woman who is always smiling, is annoyed by their great leader. Could it be possible that I don't even truly know my own mother? She wondered. Hey, Ace, Morval said, waving his hand near her head. Are you idling? Or what? No, I'm not idling, he nodded his head. Probably not a good idea. At least not up here. I don't want you falling off. Curve, thanks for the visit, but seriously, I don't want you getting into trouble, too. He started scooting backwards and smiled. Yeah, Mom can only handle one bad kid at a time. Once Morval left, Azil put her head down and just listened to the angry fids below. She couldn't understand where all their anger was coming from. Do they really hate me that much? She wondered. If anyone should be angry, it should be me, but Azil wasn't angry. If anything, sitting alone there in the pouring rain, she just felt sad. She wanted to be inside with her mother and brother, helping them to prepare for the upcoming disaster. The storm, Azil thought as she remembered why she had been sent to the roof in the first place. I forgot to warn Morval about the storm. She hoped he had heard her warning through the voco boom. Judging by all of the angry shouts, she doubted if anyone had listened to what she said. What is wrong with these fids? She wondered, banging her leg against the side of the house. Why are they all here? Why are they bothering me so much? Peeking out from beneath the crown. Azil looked at all the faces in the crowd. All of them looked angry, except for one. It was her best friend. Voda stood behind everyone, separate from the crowd, with her arms crossed. But unlike the other fids, she did not say a word. Chapter 16. Alone. As the day wore on, Azil continued to endure Lazov's punishment. Sitting on her roof all alone, she looked around at the destruction caused by the storm. What were once small puddles scattered throughout the village had now grown and merged into what looked to be small lakes. Debris from grokes, in the form of leaves, sticks and small fruits, called thubs, had littered the ground as well as the roofs of houses. By this time, all of her tormentors had given up and gone home. The weather's fury had caused them to run for shelter. But Azil did not have that option. Ironically, her only hope would need to come from the one fid she couldn't trust. So she just sat there waiting for the punishment to end, hoping it would be soon. As the storm continued to strengthen, Azil had doubts whether or not Lazov even remembered her punishment. If he had, she doubted he would even bother letting her know when it was over. He's probably afraid of the storm like all the other cowards, she thought. The previous events of that day had caused Azil's animosity for the other fids to be at an all-time high. She had never been treated so maliciously in her entire life. All day she had been accused, ridiculed, and pelted with thubs. Throughout all this, she doubted if the others even knew why she was being punished in the first place. Sitting on the roof with her arms wrapped tightly around her legs, Azil lifted her head to look around. Although she was no longer under attack by the others, evidence of their malice toward her still remained. Thubs of all sizes were piled up around her, and sticky red liquid from the fruit continued to ooze down her body. Azil quickly lowered her head as another strong blast of wind ripped through the village. The storm was brutal, but she knew its wrath wasn't intentionally directed at her, unlike the harmful actions and comments of the fids. She doubted she could ever forgive them for what they put her through. By warning them, she had risked a lot, and their lack of understanding and compassion continued to hurt her deeply. Later that day, the storm receded slightly. Peering down from the roof of her house, Azil could see no indication that her warning had been heeded. She felt as if the wind had just blown her words of caution off somewhere across the swamp. Although several fids had begun to venture out of their homes, none of them appeared to be taking precautionary actions against the devastation to come. More surprising to Azil, they appeared to have forgotten she was still there. Instead of taunting her or working together to formulate a plan for survival, they seemed to be more preoccupied with their pointless Fiark Day conversations. Even from where she sat, she could still hear the non-stop barrage of blarks and Fiarks coming from their mouths. Still, she had seen absolutely no preparation for what was to come. The only purposeful action she saw by any of the fids was the occasional attempts at removing water from their homes. With her head down, Azil listened to the rain as it continued to ricochet off the metal roof. The wind had become noticeably worse, generating a howling sound as it moved through the trees. As the storm's intensity grew again, everyone gradually made their way back to their houses. She was now the only one remaining outside. During her long, wet afternoon, Azil could do nothing but think. She thought about how alone she felt. She thought about how this temporary punishment was nothing compared to the loneliness Lukas must have felt all those years. But most of all, she was angry. Here she was trying to warn everyone about the storm, and their only response was to treat her like a criminal. I hope all those idiots get washed away by the flood, she thought, as this possibility somehow made her loneliness seem more bearable. Quite a while had passed since everyone had returned to their homes. Azil didn't mind. She was still filled with contempt for the way she had been treated and preferred to witness nature's fury over the ignorance of her neighbors. Since they had gone inside, not much had changed. Although the storm remained constant, Azil had become less aware of it. Boredom was now competing with her feelings of bitterness. As the thunderous sounds of dead branches crashed to the ground throughout the village, Azil barely lifted her head. There was nothing for her to do but sit and wait for Lazov to say when her punishment was over. Azil had given up. She no longer cared that the fids ignored her warning, and she no longer cared whether the entire village was washed away forever. All she could do is sit there as the rain and wind continued to beat against her ardent body. She closed her eyes and just listened to the powerful storm as it ripped through the village and trees above her. In a strange way, she was beginning to find these destructive forces to be calming. As streams of water flowed over her and the strong wind jostled her body, an unusual feeling of serenity grew from within. All her anger and concerns slowly faded, leaving Azil with a sense of absolute tranquility. Her head gently dropped forward as the rest of her body went limp. Forgetting about the outside world, all of her penetrating thoughts about Lazov, the storm, and the other fids melted away as she gradually drifted into a state of inner peace. But this didn't last. All of a sudden, her inner world faded as a loud voice broke through. Aze, hey Azil, she abruptly opened her eyes as she heard Voda calling her name. What are you doing up here? Azil said, wiping the rainwater out of her eyes. I came to see you, Voda said as she carefully made her way across the slippery roof. Why bother? Moaned Azil. She crossed her arms in disregard. Did your dad send you out here to pick on me some more? Voda calmly knelt beside her and delicately placed a hand on Azil's shoulder. As Azil turned towards her, Voda smirked and said, Don't be stupid. My father doesn't know I'm here. Well, if you didn't come up here to torture me, then why are you here? Why would I want to torture you? Why not? Everyone else wants to. Azil spread her arms out to reveal the red streaks covering her body. Look at me. I'm everyone's favorite fig to hate. No, you're not. The storm just has everyone anxious. Open your eyes, said Azil, motioning to the piles of thubs surrounding her. Do you not see all this black lark? She grabbed one of the sticky fruits and threw it down into her yard. You know that's not true, said Voda, shaking her head. But you can believe whatever you want. Hey, listen, I'm here because I wanted to let you know I thought about some of the things you said. Although at first most of it sounded crazy, once I had time to think about it, some of it actually started to make sense. Why are you telling me this? Because I feel bad, because it's my fault you're out here. No, it's not. How is this your fault? I'm the one who broke the rules, even if they are stupid. But what I did was worse. I told my father you went to talk to that fit up in the trees. Azil's eyes widened. What? Please tell me you didn't tell him what Lucas told me about him being a liar. What you told me really hurt. I didn't know what to do, so I know, Azil said, covering her ears. That was the stupidest thing you could have possibly done. If Lucas is telling the truth, anyone who knows will be in danger, including you. Your father could do anything to protect the truth from getting out. Voda shook her head. My dad's not going to do anything to me, and I'm sure he wouldn't hurt my best friend. Are you sure? Did you not see how quickly he shut me up? Sorry about that. He's punished me before, but this time was different. I agree. The way he treated you was really unfair, and all I was trying to do was warn everyone about the storm. Then he turned everyone against me. Come on, Az, it's not like he intended to do that. Are you sure about that? Honestly, not really, Voda said, slumping her shoulders. I'm not too sure about anything anymore. When I told my father that you went up into the trees, he got really mad. Then when I asked him about some of the things Lucas told you, he became defensive. I trust my father, but I'm starting to think you might be right. Voda looked away and slowly shook her head. I wish I didn't, but I just get this feeling my father's hiding something. According to Lucas, hiding a lot. And who knows what he'll do to keep those secrets. It's hard for me to believe my father might have harmful intentions, but I just don't know anymore. This is crazy. You need to meet Lucas. I wish I could explain everything he told me, but I can't. Most of it I didn't even understand. Maybe together we can make sense of this. Voda nodded and put a hand on Azil's shoulder. If we're going to do this, let's not wait. We need to go right now before the weather gets worse. What about your father? Won't he be mad? When I left, he was idling. I doubt he'll even notice we're gone. Voda stood up and grabbed Azil by the hand. Come on, she quickly pulled Azil to her feet. Let's go find Lucas. Chapter 17. Living his story. Unlike Azil's solo journey into the trees and along the pathway of branches, her second was much more challenging. The storm had intensified, causing the giant groaks to shake and sway. As they navigated their way through the trees, Azil and Voda's ardent feet shifted under them on the rain-soaked branches. This time there was no music to guide Azil through the maze of trees. There was only the unrelenting roar of the wind. Pathways of branches split, offering multiple options, most of which were incorrect. There were no markers or signposts to guide them, only Azil's instincts and desire for her friend to meet Lucas. Sure you know where you're going? Voda asked. Azil could barely hear her friend over the sound of the wind. What? Azil asked, turning to face Voda. Are we going the right way? Not sure, but I know what I'm looking for. Just stay close. Up ahead, Azil could see a large familiar object which stood out against the dense forest. The Scalatron. What's that? Asked Voda. That frightening thing. That would be the Groken, at least the mouth of the beast. You'll be meeting the rest of the Groken very soon. Oh, but don't call him that. It's a touchy subject. Azil and Voda continued through the trees until they arrived at Lucas's house. Streams of water flowed down the sides and dozens of loose metal panels shook in the wind. Voda's gaze turned upward as she investigated the massive and strange metal creation. This is a house, Voda asked. Huge, isn't it? This is amazing. Tell me again why we don't houses that look like this. Because we don't make houses like this, Azil said as she began to knock on the door. Waiting patiently, Azil and Voda crouched to avoid the steady deluge of rainwater, which gushed over the side of the house onto their heads. After a moment, Voda turned to Azil. Are you sure he's home? She said, while trying unsuccessfully to wipe the water from her face. Azil shrugged and firmly thumped her metal fist against the steel door much louder than the first time. Shortly after, the door opened and her eyes widened at the shock of what she saw. There standing in the door was not a middy, but a Malbig. Who are you? Azil asked as she cautiously took a step back. The big seemed confused. He quickly glanced down at his body and laughed. Azil, it's me, Lucas. What happened? You were smaller. Not anymore, those days are over. Lucas stood in the doorway and looked over Azil's shoulder at Voda. Who's the other girl? My name's Voda, she said as rainwater continued to bounce off her head and face. Lucas seemed to be lost in thought as he stared at Voda. Azil lowered her head to avoid the direct impact of the water coming off the roof. Are you going to let us in, or what? She asked impatiently. He snapped out of what seemed to be a mild trance and motioned them inside. Yes, come on in. The first thing Azil noticed as she entered Lucas's house was the constant sound of water dripping and splashing against metal. As she began to look around, she immediately noticed where it was coming from. The ceiling appeared to be leaking considerably, sending rainwater all throughout the house, which appeared to be one giant room. The place was nothing like Azil expected. In fact, it was nothing like the inside of any house she had ever seen. She imagined, if the heat was somewhat hollow, this is what it would look like on the inside. Random metal parts poked inward through the walls and ceiling. Tall vertical metal shelves along the walls held hundreds of smaller items and gadgets. And similar to the inside of Bowden's workshop, the interior space felt cramped with haphazard pathways formed by cluttered stacks of metal scraps and other materials. Azil couldn't believe what she was seeing. How could one Fid have this much stuff? She wondered. Azil's drifting attention was cut short by the sight of Voda's hand waving in front of her face. A's you in shock. Or what? This place is absolutely crazy, isn't it? Still trying to process what she was looking at. Azil quietly responded, absolute crazy. Yes, that would be an adequate description. Azil realized Lucas was no longer standing with them and appeared to be pushing a large barrel around the room. What are you doing? She asked. What does it look like? Can't you see this place is filling up with water? She looked down and realized her feet were completely submerged. When she looked up again, she noticed that Lucas had grabbed another barrel and was lifting it up onto one of the stacks in the center of the large room. Need any help? Azil asked, moving closer. Lucas looked up and pointed to the ceiling. Can you climb up onto the roof and fix all these leaks? In this storm? I don't think so. Voda approached Lucas as she looked around the room. What is all this black-a-lark? Black-a-lark? What is that? Lucas asked. Voda reached out and placed a hand on one of the shelves full of objects. This stuff. Next, she pointed to a stack of metal scraps. And that. She turned completely around, motioning to the entire room. Just about everything in here looks like black-a-lark. Azil had expected him to be offended by her comment, but his reaction was quite unexpected. Lucas walked over to Voda and squinted as he appeared to examine her face carefully. Vera? He asked. Voda tilted her head. Me? It's Voda. My name's Voda. Sorry, it's just that you remind me of someone I know. Voda glanced over at Azil. Then back to Lucas. You've been living up here in this tree your whole life, yet I remind you of someone you know. Okay, no, not my whole life, not even close, only a couple thousand years. What shouted Voda, shaking her head and laughing in disbelief. I doubt that. She turned to Azil while motioning to Lucas. Is this the guy you met? That's him, said Azil, nodding. I thought you said he was a MIDI. Suddenly, Lucas' attitude changed. He kicked a barrel over, sending it rolling across the room. I'm not a MIDI or a biggie or whatever other stupid thing you think I am. Lucas put his hands on his head and walked away from them. Azil yelled over to him. What's your problem? We came up here because we needed your help. But if this is how you're going to be, we'll just leave. She turned and started to walk toward the door with Voda following her. Lucas called out to them. Wait, what do you need help with? Azil turned around to see Lucas facing them with his arms crossed. I'll tell you if you promise to relax. How can I relax when my house is filling up with water? Azil pointed to one of the overflowing barrels. First of all, I can tell you those barrels, you're wasting your time. She walked over to one of the piles of scrap metal and pulled out a large steel spike. What are you doing with that? Asked Lucas, walking toward her. Holding the steel spike firmly in one hand, Azil shrugged. And do you want this water out of here or not? Sure. That would be nice. Azil got down on one knee, jabbed the spike into the floor, and immediately yanked it out. Hey, yelled Lucas, putting his hands up. What are you doing to my floor? He walked over to examine the hole in his floor and noticed that the water around it had begun to spiral down. See how easy that was, Azil said, watching the water level gradually decline. Lucas slowly shook his head. Now, why didn't I think of that? Sometimes the best solutions are too obvious for us to notice. Azil said, tossing the steel spike back into the scrap pile. Well, I appreciate the help. So are you ready to help us now? What do you need? And can you please explain to Voda what you told me about the humans or whatever? You mean our true history, Lucas said. Azil nodded. Yes. I tried to explain some of the things you told me to Voda, but since I didn't really understand, I confused her more than anything. Maybe if she saw that machine with the video. He hurried across the room and grabbed the small gadget from one of the shelves. When Lucas returned, he tossed the video machine to Voda. This is a video of your true history, not the one made up by your crazy leader. Holding the video player in one hand, Voda took a step back and clenched the fist of the other. That's my father you're calling crazy. Azil expected another insulting comment from Lucas, but was surprised by his reaction. He stepped closer, analyzing Voda's face intently. Is that really you? He said softly. Voda quickly jumped back and turned to Azil. Aze, what is this Blark's problem? Azil shrugged and turned to Lucas. Can you just give us a moment? She stood between the two of them and held out an arm to shield Voda. I want her to see the video. Lucas impatiently spun around and threw his hands into the air. Whatever. As he walked across the room, he turned his head and added, no problem. I've got all the time in the world, literally. As Voda began to watch the video, Azil looked up at Lucas, who was now on the other side of the room. She could sense there was something to his strange reaction to Voda, something he was not saying. Voda continued to watch the video. As she watched, her reaction in many ways mirrored that of Azil's from the previous night. When the video ended, Lucas was standing across from Voda. She bitterly looked up and stared him in the eyes. I don't know what you're trying to do. Do you realize this video, you're trying to tell me everything I know is a lie? And my father's the liar. You know I just met you, so I'm going to choose to believe the man I've known and trusted my whole life. And I'm sure everyone down in the swamp would agree with me. Voda tossed the video machine back to Lucas, who just shrugged and walked away. Azil put a hand on Voda's shoulder. Come on, Vo, think about it. What does Lucas have to gain by telling us all this bizarre information? What if he really is trying to help us? I think he's only trying to help himself. Maybe he was the leader once and nobody liked him, so he came up here to live. I think he's just jealous because my father is in charge. Azil noticed Lucas had returned and overheard her accusation. He crossed his arms and stared at Voda. This is not about me. This is not about Lazov. Originally, this was about us, all of us. The plan was to rebuild our world from the remaining fragments of our once great society. But your father had his own ideas of what this new world should look like. His vision was not a popular one at first, but quickly gained supporters. I was not one of them. I saw it had nothing to do with our original purpose, and so I opposed it. That's when your father and some of his thugs had me removed. By getting rid of me, Lazov also removed any trace of your true history and purpose. Lucas turned away from Voda and threw his hands up. After that, he was free to turn his own fantasies into reality. He looked back to Voda and shook his head. Face it, you've been living in your father's twisted little fantasy world. Voda approached Lucas and narrowed her eyes. If you think everything was so great with you around and so bad now, then why does everyone love living in the village? Why does everyone admire my father so much? We have a great life down there. I'm sure it's much more fun than living alone in a tree. I think my father's fantasy has created a wonderful society. A wonderful society, Lucas said with a laugh. What you don't understand is how much you all have sacrificed for this fantasy. You have given up things, amazing things you know absolutely nothing about. Like what? We have everything we need, Voda said. When we created ourselves, we did it for a specific and highly important purpose. And that purpose was not to spend eternity stuck in a swamp, nor were we to fear anything ever. Voda stood up straight and tall. I don't fear anything. Is that so? You're an explorer, right? I don't know how you knew that, but yes, I'm an explorer. Have you ever explored beyond the swamp? Voda narrowed her eyes. There is no beyond the swamp. I'll take that as a no, he said with a grin. What about the trees? Why have I never seen you doing any exploring up here? Voda shrugged. See, you may think you're fearless and you should be fearless, but the truth is you've been given reasons to fear based on lies. The fact is, we created ourselves to be virtually indestructible with abilities you could not even imagine. If we were really indestructible, then why are there only 76 or 77 of us left? What about all the Fids who were destroyed when they went away from the village and were never norphoonicated back into the Great Glow? Lucas crossed his arms and stared at Voda wide-eyed. Norphoony what? That must be a more recent laseism, because it's new to me. And the Great Glow, do you mean sun? Azil and Voda looked at one another for a moment, then Azil voiced her confusion. Sun? Whose sun? No, not a sun. The sun. The one in the sky. Azil shrugged. Seriously. Never mind. I guess the sun doesn't exist for those who live their lives in the fog. Azil didn't understand. She didn't know whether she had just been informed or insulted, and now she could see that Lucas himself was confused about something. Let's back up, he said. I think I need to clarify something. Yes, there are now and have always been 77 of us. And no, nobody was ever norphoon destroyed or whatever. That is why we were known as Infinidroids. The name says it all. Why 77? Asked Azil, tilting her head. That's an odd number. Why not 50 or 100? Good question. That number has always been highly significant to us. Our bodies were created from an iridium alloy, which is an extremely strong and non-corrosive metal. Iridium's atomic number, 77, hinted at what we would later determine to be the ideal population size for a community of indestructible and non-reproductive beings. Why is it we've never heard of this iridium? Voda asked, shrugging her shoulders. Though I think we have, but we've been calling it Ardum. Voda's eyes widened. Oh, Ardum. Iridium. That would make sense. Azil turned to Lucas. One thing I don't fully understand, you mentioned something about abilities. What abilities? Remember how I told you that our original purpose was to rebuild to create a new society? Well, you may have noticed that within your society there are a variety of distinct body types. There's a reason for that. Each body type and its accompanying abilities allows unique and useful ways of interacting with the world. Haven't you ever wondered why Voda is taller and more agile than you and everyone else her age? It may have crossed my mind once or twice. That's because she loves to explore. She is driven to find and discover new places, and her body was made for that. And you, Azil, you like to build things, right? She nodded. Aren't your small hands and strong arms perfect for what you love to do? It's as if they were made for making things, right? I guess so. Don't you see? Our passions and abilities are linked, and that is by choice, our choice, and our design. That is one thing even Lazov could never change even if he wanted to. What does my father have to do with this? Voda asked. Your father has everything to do with this. As the only one in your village who remembers our true history and purpose, it is his responsibility to remind everyone of this. But instead, he has hidden the truth which has caused your society to lose its way. I don't get it. Why would my father keep this from us? What you're saying doesn't make any sense. You're right. It doesn't make any sense. The lie he has created is bigger than him. It has been growing and evolving like some sort of creature for thousands of years. I doubt if he even knows the real truth from what he's made up. Voda stepped in front of Lucas and stared up at him. How do I know you're not the one making things up? She pointed at him while continuing to shout. I think you're just bitter. Because you're all alone. Here we go again. Lucas turned away from Voda for a moment, then faced her directly. Listen, I've always known the truth. I wish I didn't, but it's impossible for me to unknow it. If I ignored it, I'd be living a lie. I realized a long time ago I'd rather live my life completely alone than have to play along with this outrageous lie your father has created. My father is not a liar. You don't know him like I do. The man I know is honest and kind, unlike you. Voda turned and ran to the door. Without looking back, she yanked it open and bolted out into the storm. Azil turned to Lucas. I'm sorry. I thought Voda would understand. She turned and was about to run after Voda, but Lucas grabbed her wrist. Wait, this is not the worst of the storm. It's called a hurricane, and this one is bad, really bad. Everyone down in your village is in danger. Azil looked confused. I thought we were virtually indestructible. Yes, you are. But you're also made of metal, which means when you're in deep water, you sink like a rock. And since your village is going to be underwater by this time tomorrow, you're all in serious danger. Everyone in your society will most likely be washed away by the flood unless you warn them. I'll try, but what if they won't listen? Then you yell, scream, do whatever you have to. Everyone is going to need to find someplace safe up and off the ground. Lucas released Azil's wrist. I'll think of something, she said, running to the door. As she opened the door, she turned back to Lucas. Thanks for the warning. Azil frantically ran out into the rain and chased after her friend. Chapter 18. Inspired. Azil stood in her workshop and listened to the powerful storm as it raged throughout the night. In the past, she would have just stood by idling the night away, but that all changed the moment she realized it was unnecessary. She imagined using this extra time inventing or enjoying the serenity of the swamp in the night glow. But unfortunately, that would have to wait. In that moment, all she could think about was the upcoming flood and probable destruction of their village. Lucas's warning continued to repeat in her mind as she searched for a possible solution. If the flood was going to be as bad as he believed, saving the village would be completely futile. Azil immediately realized she needed to focus her attention on saving the Fids instead. She imagined herself leading everyone up into the trees, but knew that was not an option they would choose voluntarily. Most of the Fids were afraid of the trees, and this fear would only be amplified by the strong wind and heavy rain. Azil looked around her tiny workshop for inspiration, then stopped. What am I even doing? She thought, angrily shaking her head. She immediately recalled the previous day on the roof and how she was mistreated by everyone. Those idiots aren't my responsibility. I warned them about the storm and they ignored me, so they deserve whatever they get. The next morning, Azil opened the front door and was greeted with a rush of water pouring into her house. As she cautiously stepped outside, she noticed the water had risen to the point she could no longer see the ground. The strong wind whizzed around her body as she continued her assessment of the situation. Several large fallen branches protruded from the surface of the water, making the village nearly unrecognizable. Where is everybody? Azil wondered as she pushed through the wind and water. At first it appeared to her that she was the only Fid brave enough to go Azil's side, but there was one other. Voda was standing ankle-deep in water outside her window. "Aze, over here!" Voda yelled over the roaring wind. As Azil approached, she saw that Voda had set the unconventional in the window of her room. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm glad you brought this thing back," Voda said, smiling as she picked up the gadget. "Sorry, I threw it on the ground. It's okay. I knew you were upset." Azil looked into her room through the window and shrugged. "What's going on in there?" "My room's flooding and I need to get the water out." Azil shook her head. "I made the barometer for sucking up bugs. Doubt it will work for that." To her amazement, Voda flipped a switch on the machine and water began to spurt out the window. "Wow, looks like you proved me wrong." Azil watched in awe as the water in the room slowly disappeared. When it was all gone, Voda turned off the unconventional and gently placed it inside. "And that's how it's done," Voda said, wiping some mud off her hands. "Good, ready to go." "Go where?" Voda asked. "I was going to go check out all the damage caused by the storm." "I guess so." Voda's eyes widened as she glanced around at the debris-filled floodwaters. "I've never seen the village like this. Let's see what the rest of it looks like." Azil slowly led Voda through the water as they investigated the damage caused by the storm. All the houses appeared to be okay, despite the rising water. As they approached the center of the village, Azil noticed logs and other debris floating by. Voda stopped and turned her body, looking at the entire village. "What a mess. It's not over yet." "I know you don't believe anything Lucas told us, but when I first met him, he warned me about this storm, and he was right." "Yeah, he was right about that." Voda paused for a moment and turned to Azil. "Aze, there was something strange about Lucas." Azil grinned. "Good observation. No, seriously. Did he seem familiar in some way?" "Not to me." "Why? Do you think you may have seen him before?" Voda shook her head. "I don't think so. You probably would have remembered him." "Yeah, Lucas is a bit odd," said Voda, smiling. "No kidding. But he seems to know a lot about everything. What exactly did he say about the storm?" "Yeah, about the storm," said Azil, lowering her head. "I wanted to talk to you about that." "What? Did he say it was going to be worse than it already is?" Azil nodded. "Much worse. And it's not just the storm he wanted to warn us about. He thinks there's going to be a flood, a major flood." "Like how major? You really want to know?" "Yes, tell me." "Lucas thinks we could all be underwater in less than a day." Voda's jaw dropped. "Underwater." "That's what he said. And you believe he's telling the truth?" Azil sighed. "I wish I didn't. If you think he's telling the truth, someone needs to do something." "Like what?" "There's no way any of us are going to stop a flood." Voda put her hand on Azil's shoulder and looked her in the eye. "But someone could come up with a plan to keep everyone safe." "No way. Don't look at me," Azil said, crossing her arms. "I already tried to warn those blocks. Never again. So you'd rather watch everyone suffer." Azil paused to consider this possibility. "Seriously, Az?" "No," said Azil, shaking her head. "But that doesn't mean their safety is my responsibility." "Who knows? Maybe someone else already has a plan." Voda raised her arms and looked around the village. "Do you see anyone around here with a plan?" "I don't. Besides, if anyone can come up with a good plan, it's you. If I do this, I'll expect your help." "Absolutely." Voda put her arm around Azil. "We'll figure this thing out together." "Sounds good," Azil said, nodding. Voda looked down and ran her foot through the water. "So this flood, what's the worst it could do?" "A lot. It could destroy all of our homes and then drag the remaining scraps somewhere far away. Oh, and for the Fid population, we would all sink to the bottom and be swept away by the strong current. Azil shrugged. That's what Lucas told me. So what you're saying is this flood, it might get ugly. Right on cue, a powerful burst of wind and rain whooshed through the village. Yes, though the probability of ugliness looks pretty high right about now. Azil shouted over the screaming wind. As they talked, debris from swamp growths continued to fall around them. Water streamed around their ankles carrying small sticks and leaves. They both fought to keep their balance against the strong wind, and Azil found her friend leaning into her for support. I can't imagine the wind getting any stronger than this, Voda said. I can deal with the wind. The thought of being underwater? So A's got any ideas? Said Voda, picking up a large growth leaf as it floated through her legs. No, but I think you just found one. What? A leaf. Voda handed the leaf to Azil. Yes, did you notice how it floated across the water when it was upside down? What if we made a giant leaf? Something that could fit everyone in the village. We could float instead of sink. Have you ever made a leaf before? Voda asked. No, but we have all that scrap metal at the heap. We could make the huge leaf out of metal. Voda clapped her hands together. Okay, let's make this thing. This huge metal leaf to hold 76 fids. She turned toward Azil. This is going to be really, really difficult, isn't it? Azil nodded. Yes, really. Well, maybe I should get my brother to help us. Seriously? She looked at Voda, shrugging. Bowden? Yes, if you hadn't noticed, this village isn't exactly full of skilled, eager workers. He's all we've got right now, that's true. Azil tried to imagine the other Fids building anything and shook her head. I guess Bowden will have to do. Are you sure he'll help us? Don't worry about that part. I know how to deal with him. Just get whatever tools you need from your workshop and meet us at the heap as soon as you can. Voda looked down at the rising water, which was almost up to her knees. We need to hurry. I agree. Azil turned and began the short wet slog back to her house. Chapter 19. The Glow Thief. Azil trudged through the floodwaters, carrying a large metal hammer and a blowtorch. As she exited the village, she could see the heap, which now resembled a towering island of metal scraps. At the bottom of the heap, just above the waterline, she noticed two Fids sitting, Voda and her brother. You two didn't have to wait for me, shouted Azil over the wind and rain. Voda stood up and shouted back. Yes, we did. You're the one with the plan. Plan? I wouldn't go that far. It's really just an idea. Voda grabbed a chunk of metal and threw it into the water. It took you all that time to get here, and you still don't even have a plan. Sorry, my mom was all worried about the flood. She didn't want me to go outside. Bowden stood up and shrugged. Didn't you tell her about your idea to make a giant metal leaf or whatever? I tried, but I don't think she really understood, said Azil, climbing up onto the heap. She suggested I wait until after the storm. After the storm, said Voda, narrowing her eyes. That's exactly what I said before realizing I was wasting my time trying to explain it. Okay, so you're here? Let's get this thing started. Voda paused for a moment, noticing the blowtorch. Is that what I think it is? Azil confidently held it in the air. Yes, I brought a blowtorch and I'm going to use it. I don't think that's such a good idea, said Voda, shaking her head. Isn't that thing really bad for? It's all right, though, said Bowden, calmly interrupting his sister. A's just don't let our father see it. If you say so, she said, nodding reluctantly. So what now? Asked Voda, tapping her foot against a steel pipe, which protruded from the side of the heap. Azil quickly glanced around. I guess we should start by gathering lots of large steel plates. Sounds like a plan. Bowden turned to climb the heap. Hold it. Voda shouted. Can someone explain to me what I'm looking for? What exactly does a steel plate look like? It's big and rectangular, said Bowden, holding his arms out wide. And flat like a sheet. Azil said, that might be helpful if I knew what a sheet was. The tapping of Voda's foot ceased with a frustrated bang. Never mind that. So it's a big and flat piece of metal in the shape of a rectangle. Got it. What I don't understand is how are the three of us going to pull this off? We need to make this thing large enough to hold everyone in the entire village. Aren't we going to need more help? Bowden looked doubtful as he responded. I don't see that happening. He's right, Azil said. They're afraid to leave the houses, and even if we could get them to help, how useful could they really be? True, Bowden said. Most of these Fids have never done anything challenging in their entire lives. Visibly agitated, Voda pushed past Bowden and Azil. Well, now's their chance. Where are you going? Bowden asked. To drag some Fids out of their homes if I have to. Azil and Bowden could only watch as Voda hopped down into the waist-high floodwaters and plodded back toward the village. Bowden turned to Azil and grinned. It looks like it's just you and me. Azil tried unsuccessfully to return the smile. She pointed to a far section of the heap. Why don't you go over there and look for some sheets of metal, the bigger the better. I'm climbing up to the flat part to start welding. Bowden shrugged and walked away. Now alone, Azil began to look around for materials to start the project. In particular, she was looking for 2 large, rectangular metal panels she could begin to weld together. She knew that, in order to build a floating leaf enough to hold all 76 fids, they'd have to gather every large sheet of metal they could find. Azil immediately found 2 panels which appeared to be in relatively good condition. With her blowtorch in one hand, she awkwardly tried to stand the panels side by side. As soon as she was able to get them in a vertical position, a strong gust of wind caught the panels and tossed them down the side of the heap. As if this wasn't going to be difficult enough, thought Azil, tossing the blowtorch down. She knew the panels she had just tried were way too big and awkward for her to deal with alone, especially in this wind. For a moment, Azil wondered if she should ask Bowden for help, but decided against it. Instead, she opted to try a different approach. She quickly found 2 more, much smaller and thicker panels. Azil carried them over to where she had dropped her blowtorch and placed them next to one another. Unlike her previous attempt, this time the panels stayed in place. Holding the 2 panels in position with one hand, Azil fired up the blowtorch with the other. As if in defiance of the heavy rain, an intense blue flame instantly emerged. She carefully positioned the blowtorch on the seam between the 2 panels. Suddenly, she was reminded of the wind's growing intensity as the panels began to vibrate. Then a strong gust shifted one of the panels just enough to create a gap between the 2. Azil could feel the wind trying to rip them from her grasp, but held tight. If that wasn't bad enough, her feet were beginning to slide on the wet metal beneath her. Part of her just wanted to give up to let go of the panels and watch them fly away, but she knew she didn't have that option. As the rain and wind raged on, she tried hopelessly to reposition the 2 large wet panels. Every time she got them into position, another violent gust would cause them to vibrate and shift around. This is impossible, she thought. Despite her effort to connect the panels, Azil realized she desperately needed assistance. Bowden, she shouted hopelessly into the roaring wind. Azil needed his help but was unable to get his attention. She stood up and began waving her arms frantically. Finally, Bowden noticed her and joined her at the top. What's wrong? He asked. She held up the 2 panels and asked, can you just hold these 2 together? Bowden grabbed one in each hand and held them side by side. Like this? He asked. Yes, but they need to be touching or it won't work. With Bowden firmly holding the 2 panels in place, Azil began to fuse them together using her blowtorch. This is much better, she thought. Although the situation was both outrageous and awkward, Azil felt a strange sense of comfort as well. Was it the fact that Bowden and the panels had blocked the rain and wind, creating a temporary sanctuary for her? Or was she reacting to the mesmerizing flicker of the torch's flame against the harsh backdrop of nature's fury? As quickly as the moment of serenity had begun, it was extinguished by a disturbance from below. Snapping back into reality, Azil noticed someone climbing up the side of the heap. Bowden. Where's your daughter? She asked. Who Gasa? Yes, do you know where Gus is? Bowden pointed toward his house. She's at home with my father. Are you sure about that? Asked Azil, motioning downward behind him. Bowden turned to see his daughter struggling to navigate her way up the side of the heap. Jersa, he shouted. Bowden immediately let go of the metal panels and ran to assist his daughter. Azil could only watch as the metal crashed down in front of her. As jarring as it was, something even more disturbing had caught her attention. Standing in waist-deep water at the bottom of the heap was Bowden's father. Lazov angrily smashed his fist down with a splash as he glared up at his son. This is unacceptable, he roared. Bowden looked at his father and shrugged. But Dad, we're making something important to save everyone from the flood. Lazov looked at the tower of metal scraps in front of him and laughed. He grabbed a large metal chunk from the pile and held it in front of him. Seriously? You're out in the rain playing with this lark. He casually tossed the chunk of metal into the water, then stared at Bowden. Enough of this nonsense. You need to come home with me now. Lazov pointed to his son and motioned him to come down. Azil quickly caught up with Bowden, who was carrying his daughter down the side of the heap. Where are you going? I need your help. Bowden walked past her and shrugged, then joined his father down in the water. Azil could only watch as Lazov grabbed his son's arm and stared at him. Do you know what an embarrassment you are? No son of mine should be out in the rain, struggling, messing around with all this useless junk. Do I need to remind you what fun is? Because it looks like you've forgotten. Now take Gaza back home. Lazov pointed back toward the village. And you better be there when I get back. Azil couldn't believe what she had just heard, and now the only one who could help her was walking away. Bowden, she shouted. What are you doing? I thought you were going to help. He turned back toward her, shrugging again. Sorry, Az. I wish I could help, but I really should be doing something fun. Are you kidding me? Sometimes you need to do things that aren't fun, and this is one of those times. Bowden turned toward Azil and appeared to be about to say something. Then he noticed the rage on his father's face. Lazov sharply pointed toward the village. You need to take your daughter home right now. Bowden picked his daughter up, placed her on his shoulders, and began the difficult slog back to the village. Azil could only shake her head as she watched him push his way through the rising floodwaters. Lazov waited until he was far enough away and turned to Azil. Who do you think you are getting my son involved in your pathetic plan? Standing on the side of the heap, she glared down at him. This plan is the only thing I could think of that could possibly save us. Did you have a plan? She asked, throwing her arms up and looking around. Because I don't see you doing anything to help anyone. What I do is none of your concern. What is wrong with you? Don't you care about anyone but yourself? Or suddenly Azil's eyes widened as she began to understand Lazov's true motivation. She stepped closer and looked him directly in the eye. Or is all this so you don't have to admit to everyone that you were wrong about the storm and that you've been wrong about everything? Lazov narrowed his eyes. Don't you admit I'm a liar? Oh, I know about all your recent discoveries. You mean the truth? Is that what he told you? Said Lazov, rolling his eyes. Lukas never got it. Azil impatiently shook her head. Got what? He always took life too seriously, and now he's trying to corrupt you too. I don't understand. How is knowing the truth corrupting me? Because it's getting in the way of what's really important fun. Azil dropped her head into her hands. She couldn't believe Lazov's bizarre rationale. And this, said Lazov, pointing to the heap, what you're doing out here in this storm, this is definitely not fun. He shook his head. You really need to stop this foolishness and go back to the village. Are you dense? Shouted Azil, stomping her foot. If I were you, I'd want me as far away from that village as possible. Aren't you worried that the truth might just slip out and ruin everybody's fun hurricane-filled day? Hurricane, huh? Lazov said with a grin. I haven't heard that word in quite some time. Looking up at him, Azil crossed her arms. Seriously, maybe I should tell everyone their great leader is nothing but a big liar. Lazov laughed. Like they'd listen to you. Azil realized he had a point, but didn't want him to think she was backing down. Lucky for you, I have more important matters I need to attend to, like saving everyone from being washed away by the flood. Azil, said Lazov, grinning. You have always been a useful one. Every lifetime it's been something with you. Always making things, making discoveries. But I never thought you'd discover my secret. He pointed to her, then wagged his finger. My only mistake was letting you get close to my family. That will never happen again. Lazov turned and noticed several Fids approaching them. He turned back to Azil and lowered his voice as he slowly approached her. You think I feel threatened by this little discovery of yours? These Fids do what I want them to do, say what I want them to say, and know what I want them to know. Lazov's eyes narrowed as he moved even closer to Azil. That's how it's always been. And that's how it will always be. Azil was caught off guard by Lazov, who quickly reached out and grabbed her blowtorch. He held it high in the air and turned to address the onlookers. Can anyone tell me what this is? He shouted over the roaring wind. Simultaneously, everyone in the crowd answered, Blark-a-lark. Yes, but this isn't just any ordinary Blark-a-lark. This is morphological Blark-a-lark. The worst kind of Blark-a-lark in all of Zovia. Lazov looked down at Azil shamefully. This one thinks she can just drain our very own great glow of its energy, the energy that gives us life. Is this how your father raised you? To create more blindness by using dangerous morphological Blark-a-lark like this? Why, Azil? Why would you purposely endanger all of us? Is all of this just a cry for attention? Well, no more attention for you. He turned back to the others and motioned for them to leave. Everyone, there is nothing to see here but a pathetic downer with nothing better to. Let's all get back to doing what we do best, having fun. As all the Fids stood in the waist-deep water and cheered, Lazov turned to Azil and smiled. She allowed him this temporary display of dominance, but as soon as everyone left, she pointed at him and expressed her frustration. You really do care more about yourself than anyone else. Well, I'm not like you. I just can't stand by carelessly as everyone is washed away by the storm. Lazov angrily narrowed his eyes. You better not forget who you're talking to. He turned around and began to walk away. Partly to be heard over the roaring wind, but mostly to make her point, Azil shouted back, "Oh, I may be the only one, but I know who I'm talking to." After Lazov had left, she climbed back up to the top of the heap and sat beside the two panels she had started welding a tiny fraction of what she had hoped to be a much larger project. This is not good, she thought. She bitterly glanced back toward the village, recalling the control Lazov had on everyone, especially his own son. Bowden, Azil thought, sadly shaking her head. When is he going to learn to stand up for himself? All of a sudden, she was filled with anger, recalling how he just abandoned her. She grabbed a kinnock from the heap, stood up, and hurled it toward the village. When are you going to start acting like a big? Azil dropped to her knees as the powerful storm jostled her small body around. Hopeless and alone, she sat back down and looked at the two panels. Working on the giant metal leaf was now the last thing on her mind. Azil's thoughts kept returning to the strange confrontation she had with Lazov. Most of what he said continued to anger her, but one bizarre comment in particular brought a wry smile to her face. "So I've been a nuisance for many lifetimes, huh?" Now, without her blowtorch, she was at a loss. Azil stood up and looked around for a solution, another way to connect the sheets of metal. Practically everything in the area was underwater except for the massive pile of metal below her feet. One thing she noticed was how the moving floodwaters created a number of small spirals in certain places as it flowed around the heap. There were also a couple larger spirals which appeared to be collecting some of the debris that floated by. She observed how they had gathered dozens of sticks and leaves, but something else caught her attention. Numerous vines of all lengths and sizes had clustered together, sparking a possible solution to her problem. Yes, Azil, this might work, she thought as she quickly made her way to the bottom of the heap. Azil immediately gathered as many vines as she could and hauled them back up to the top where she had been working. The next part of her plan required a metal rod, which was easy to find because they were quite common among the scraps of metal around her. She now had everything she needed and quickly got back to work. With her new technique for connecting the metal plates, Azil was more productive than she had been all day. Due to the rain, this new approach seemed to make much more sense than using the blowtorch. Azil was now able to connect the panels without having to hold them up against the powerful wind. She simply used the rod to punch holes along the edge of the metal sheets, then weave them together with the vines. Despite the effectiveness of her new approach, she was still very agitated and couldn't stop thinking about Lazov and his lies. How could someone be so selfish, she wondered. With each angry jab of the steel rod along the edge of the metal sheet, she imagined having lived through hundreds of lives of his lies. I hope I made that lying Blark-face's life miserable every single time. He only cares about himself anyway. Azil dropped the steel rod, aligned the holes on two of the metal plates, and slammed them together. As she forced a vine in and out of the metal holes, her disgust for Lazov intensified. And for him to stand by and do nothing knowing we're all in danger. Infinidroids, what a joke. All of this, all their helplessness, all their fears, it's all because of him. Azil suddenly found herself smashing her ardent fist against a steel sheet. She was unsure what exactly had sparked this intense reaction. Was it because of Lazov? His lies? Or maybe it was the fact that there was nobody there to help her. Either way, the experience of constantly being pelted by rain and debris wasn't exactly improving the situation. In that moment, all she knew was that she felt angrier than she'd been her entire life, possibly her entire existence. Just as she was about to let out a violent scream, she looked up and realized she was no longer alone and not the only angry one. Voda had returned with two other Fitz Azil's brother, Morval, and his friend, Bebus. Are you kidding me with these two? Azil thought. Just as she was about to protest, Voda interrupted. Where did he go? Azil shrugged. Who, Bowden? Your dad told him to go home, and seriously, this is unacceptable, shouted Voda as she angrily climbed the pile of metal. Azil had never seen her friend so intense and so irate. This unusual sight caused her to giggle uncontrollably as she began to speak. Funny, that's the same thing your father said. Voda stopped, put her hands on her hips, and stared wide-eyed at Azil. What are you laughing at? You clearly need Bowden's help, she said, pointing to the few steel plates that had been stitched together. How can you laugh at a time like this? The situation is absolutely dire. Azil couldn't hold back and giggled again. Dire, I know. We're all doomed. And it's all your brother's fault. A slight grin appeared on Voda's face. It is. I'm glad you agree. She then narrowed her eyes. Wait, what do you mean we're doomed? You did see this thing, right? Said Azil, motioning to the small segment of the metal leaf she had completed. There's just not enough time to finish this. I've been working on it all day, and this is all I've been able to do. So, said Voda, shrugging, you just need to keep working on it. Why, so your father can come back and sabotage everything again? You know, he took away my blowtorch, right? Voda pointed to the work Azil had accomplished with the vines. It looks like you were still able to get something going. That's nothing. Azil glanced at the two boys, then back to Voda. The four of us would barely fit in there. It needs to hold 76 fids. Azil shook her head as she sadly looked at the unfinished metal leaf. Finishing this today is just not possible. So that's it, you're not even going to try? Seriously? Voda threw her arms into the air. We desperately need you now, Az. I did try. I've been out here alone trying all day, but now it's too late. There's just not enough time. And the truth is nobody cares. I mean, look, you were only able to find 2 fids out of the entire village. It's just not enough. I can find more fids, but we can't do it without you, said Voda, patting Azil on the back. Please just stick with it. Right now, you're the only hope that we've got. Azil reluctantly nodded. Okay, but I'm going to need more help. And tell your brother to get back out here. And don't worry, he'll be back. I dare my father to try to stop us this time. Just focus on this leaf thing and leave the rest to me. Voda turned and cautiously climbed down the slippery pile of metal scraps. She then hopped back into the water, which was now up to her chest. With a renewed sense of urgency, Azil turned to her 2 volunteers who appeared to be occupied with their own unusual interests. Her brother, Morval, was taking small sheets of metal and tossing them into the air. He then watched as the wind carried them off into the nearby swamp forest. Azil then turned to Bebus, who also looked busy. He had a metal rod in each hand and was banging them against various other metal scraps. Azil could only smile and shake her head as she listened to the odd and repetitive sounds he was making. Interesting sounds, she thought. I wonder if that's what Lucas meant by music. Okay, you two, see that pile of metal sheets over there? Said Azil, pointing to the other side of the heap. I want you to take those sheets and put holes in them with a metal rod. After you've done that, bring the sheets to me and I'll connect them using these vines. I got that. Bebus looked at Morval and cocked his head to one side. Did she say she wanted us to mine Vevel shoals with muddy sneets? Azil walked over to Bebus and shoved him forcefully. Stop acting stupid. You know what I mean. She glared at both of them. If you two aren't going to take this seriously, then you should just leave right now because what we are doing here is extremely important. Bebus threw up his hands and stepped back while Morval stared at his sister, wide-eyed. I'm not trying to be mean, said Azil, attempting to remain upbeat. You just need to understand that, although this might not seem like fun to you, it is really, really important. Morval interrupted, but Voda promised us this would be fun. She lied, replied Azil, glaring at her brother. This is the opposite of fun. The goal here is not to have fun. The goal here is survival. And I'm going to need both of you to help me to help everyone. Her eyes shifted back and forth between the two of them. You both understand, right? Bebus and Morval nodded reluctantly. So are you guys in? The two guys repeated their half-hearted nodding. That doesn't look very convincing, said Azil, narrowing her eyes. Morval threw up his arms. Okay, yes, we'll help. He motioned to Bebus. Come on, let's just do this. Azil smiled slightly as she watched Bebus follow her brother to the stack of steel panels. Turning back to her project, she rubbed her chin and tried to remember what she had been doing. Vines. I need more vines, she thought, turning to walk back down to where she had originally found them. When she returned to the bottom of the heap and looked into the water, she couldn't believe her eyes. The amount of debris collected by the spiraling floodwaters had nearly doubled. Even more shocking to her was what the debris contained. Among the vines and branches were chunks of houses and other parts of the village. This is bad, she thought, shaking her head. Suddenly, she had a horrible thought. She imagined her mother, all alone, as their house crumbled around her. This vision sparked a renewed sense of urgency as Azil quickly scooped up a handful of vines. Returning to the top of the heap, Azil decided to check in on the progress of her 2 assistants. In the distance, she could see that Morval and Bebus appeared to be focused on their task. Are you guys almost done? Over there? Azil yelled over the raging wind. As she approached, she noticed that they were working very slowly and hesitantly. What's taking so long? She shouted as she went over to check on them. When she finally saw what they were doing, her jaw dropped. What are you guys doing? They sat in a pile of metal sheets, which were all completely covered in dents and punctures. No, yelled Azil, shaking her head. This is all wrong. Morval stood up to explain. We tried to cover them with holes, like you said, but it wasn't easy. Azil picked up one of the damaged sheets, looked it over, and forcefully tossed it back into the pile. Great, these are all ruined. Please don't do any more, she said, lowering her head. Bebis stood up and shrugged. Do you want us to leave? Azil took a moment to consider her options. No, I guess we're going to need more metal sheets since none of these are any good. Do you two think you can find more sheets like these, but without the holes? Morval and Bebus left to look for more sheets of metal while Azil closely inspected the ones they had worked on. What were they thinking? She wondered, shaking her head. How could they not understand my simple instructions? At first she doubted them, but then she began to wonder if she was partly to blame. Was I not clear enough? I just assumed they knew what I was talking about. Looks like I was wrong. Azil went back to work, but she couldn't stop thinking about what went wrong with Morval and Bebus. How could they have known if what they were doing was right or wrong? This stuff is obvious to me because I've been doing it my whole life. They only know what they've learned, what they've done. She finished connecting the metal sheets that remained and went to see if the others had found any more. To her surprise, they had amassed a large pile. Great, this should be enough to finish, she said. I guess you don't need us anymore, Bebus said with his head hanging low. Yeah, we really don't know what we're doing, Morval said as they both turned to go. Azil quickly stopped them. Where do you two think you're going? We're not done in putting this thing together. Morval's eyes widened. Aren't you afraid we'll mess something up? Azil looked around at all the damage the storm had caused so far. I don't think you could possibly do more damage than the storm has already done. She grabbed a metal rod in one hand and a metal sheet in the other. Come on, you two, let me show you this trick I learned. Makes punching the holes much easier. Chapter 20. Lozov's Chant. Azil and her two assistants had made progress on the project, which was beginning to resemble a large upside-down leaf. Her newfound patience with them was starting to pay off. She held up one of the metal plates Morval and Bebus had worked on and looked at it closely. These holes are perfect. Great job, guys. Bebus looked up from what he was doing. It's not as bad as I thought. This is actually kind of fun now that I know how to do it. Morval nodded in agreement and they both went back to work. Azil heard clanking noises behind her and turned to see Voda and 3 other Fids climbing up the heap. Voda looked up at Azil and let out an exasperated sigh. I don't know if they don't care or if they're all just afraid, but nobody will leave their houses. Well, what did you expect? Said Azil, shrugging. At least you were able to get some help. Azil didn't seem to mind that there were only 3. She was glad to see anyone who was willing to lend a hand. Voda looked amazed when she noticed all the work they had accomplished while she was gone. Looks like you've been busy. I think we're ready to test it, but first we'll need to carry it down there. Azil glanced to the bottom of the heap and noticed the intensity of the floodwaters had increased. Come on, we need to hurry. We're all going to have to work together, she said, pointing to the leaf. Azil quickly gathered all the volunteers together. As everyone gathered around the giant leaf, they were immediately interrupted by the sound of chanting. Nikiti nik nik nikiti nak. Azil and the others turned to see Lozov, chest deep in the water, acting giddy and waving his arms back and forth. I've got a surprise for you all, he shouted with a huge smile on his face. You are going to love this. I have created a brand new day to celebrate this watery wonder swamp. Yes, my Fids, you're about to experience the first ever Nikitinak day. Azil and Voda looked at one another with bewilderment as he continued. Okay, are you all ready? This is going to be a blast. For the rest of the day, we will all wave our arms like this and continuously repeat the following phrase. Ready? Here we go. Nickety nick nick nickety knock. Now pay attention, everyone excluding Azil, who was growing impatient, repeated the phrase. Nickety nick nick nickety knock. Azil turned to see Voda following along and nudged her sharply. What are you doing? Voda shrugged. I don't know. Habit, I guess. What they saw next was even more unbelievable. Lazov wasn't the only one standing in the water. Behind him, a line of Fids stretched out toward the village. It appeared that everyone in the village had followed him to the heap and were all enthusiastically waving their arms back and forth, doing the Nikiti Nok Day chant. Please tell me this is not happening, Azil said as she watched the crowd approaching. Oh, it's happening, Voda reassured her. All 3 of the Fids Voda brought had left to join the crowd down in the water, while surprisingly, Morval and Bebus remained. Now how are we going to carry this enormous thing down? Azil asked. We have bigger problems, said Voda, pointing to the group in the water. Azil noticed that waves had begun to violently shove all the Fids around. Even Lazov was having difficulty standing now. Amazingly, they all continued chanting and waving their arms. Azil had seen enough and yelled out to the group. What are you all doing? Do you really think this is fun? Lazov interrupted. What do you know about fun? All you do is work, work, work. He noticed some of the Fids had stopped chanting and quickly turned to the crowd. Anna, don't listen to that downer. Let's hear that chant. Nikiti nick nick nikiti knock. Azil gathered Voda, Kerval and Bivas, and tried to move the giant still unfinished leaf, but it wouldn't budge. It's just too heavy, Azil said. I know, we need more Fids. Voda started walking back toward the crowd in the water. Attention, Fids. We need more help to move this thing, she shouted, pointing to the huge leaf. If we can get it into the water, we'll have a safe place to go when the flood gets worse. Voda continued her plea as she eagerly encouraged the Fids in the water to join her. To Azil's surprise, many of the Fids who had previously stopped chanting began to climb out of the water. One after another, they piled onto the heap, and before long at least a dozen Fids had gathered around Voda. Azil was thrilled to see all the volunteers, especially the one named Boden. Voda turned and shouted to her friend. Is this enough? Azil smiled and shouted back. Perfect. The group quickly joined Azil, who enthusiastically guided them. Come on, let's all gather around, she said, motioning the volunteers to stand around the leaf. Now let's spread out evenly. Okay, when I give the signal, we all need to lift this thing and carry it down to the water. Despite its weight, it should float. Azil looked around to see if everyone was in position. Are you all ready? Okay, lift. With the help of the additional Fids, it was fairly easy to get the massive leaf off the ground, but much more difficult to carry it down the side of the heap. Every strong gust of wind caused the leaf to shift and rotate, knocking some Fids down and causing the others to slide around on the wet nettle. The entire group struggled with every awkward step as they made their way down to the rising floodwaters. Slowly, we're almost there, said Azil, guiding them on. As they carefully set the gigantic metal leaf into the water, she noted something she hadn't considered. The turbulent waters had generated waves that were knocking against the side of the heap as well as the metal leaf. One powerful wave after another smashed up against the leaf, continuously knocking it against the heap. Despite their efforts, some of the volunteers had allowed the strong waves to rip the large metal object out of their hands. Don't let go. Try to hold it still, Azil yelled in desperation. Her pleas were useless against the strength of the waves. One by one, each of the volunteers lost their grip. The ones who were able to hang on were pulled down from the heap into the raging floodwaters. Waves continued to crash against the giant leaf, slamming it against the side of the heap. Although the steel plates held up against the pressure, the vines were quickly being ripped to shreds by the sharp and jagged metal objects of the heap. As the metal plates separated, water immediately gushed in through the cracks. Azil felt helpless as she watched the most important creation of her life break apart before her eyes. The sight quickly became too much for her to bear. Covering her eyes with her hands, Azil screamed, "No!" Before she could even begin to consider a solution, their only hope for survival had disappeared beneath the floodwaters. Azil slumped and turned to Voda. I thought it would work, but I didn't think. I'm such an idiot. Idiot? Far from it. Voda grabbed her by the shoulders and looked her in the eyes. Your idea was brilliant. Yeah, real brilliant, Azil said, rolling her eyes. She glanced over to where she last saw the leaf. If it was so brilliant, why did it fall apart so easily? There's no way you could have known how intense the water would be. These waves, they weren't like that when we started. You did everything you could. But that's not going to save these Fids. The leaf was supposed to save everyone. Everyone was relying on me, and I let them down. I've never seen this side of you, said Voda, a smile creeping on her face. You do care. What are you talking about? Asked Azil, shaking her head. You really do care about all these Fids? Of course I care. I've always cared. I just get frustrated because I see our potential. All of us, we were meant for much greater things. I agree, Voda said, nodding. This isn't over. There's got to be another way. She stood up straight and looked around. Azil grabbed her arm to get her attention. How? The leaf, that was my only plan. There's no time to do anything else. It's just too late. It's never too late, said Voda, moving past Azil toward the crowd. She threw her arms up and called out to everyone. Stop. Everyone stop chanting. If you want to survive, you're going to need to listen to me. The water is becoming too rough. Everyone needs to climb up here until we can think of a better solution. The water is still rising, and we don't know when or if it will stop. Surprised, Azil watched as the other Fids, including Lazov, silently began to climb out of the water. One by one, they pulled themselves up onto the craggy metal island. She smiled with a sense of relief as the last of them stepped out of the water. Suddenly, Azil heard the loud grinding screech of metal on metal followed by an intense rumble. The relief she felt immediately transformed to horror as she began to realize that all the added weight had destabilized the entire heap. Get back into the water. Azil screamed over the terrible screeching noise. There's too much weight. Everyone get back into the water. Voda glanced around and motioned to everyone. Let's get out of here. Simultaneously, everyone moved toward the edge of the heap. Azil watched as many of the Fids quickly returned to the floodwaters, while others struggled against the shifting metal debris. The great pile of scrap metal undulated under its shifting weight. Azil and Voda waited at the edge of the heap, helping the others back into the water. Once everyone had gotten away from the crumbling pile of metal, Azil looked back, just as the top gave way and collapsed, sending metal debris flying in all directions. Come on, Voda shouted from the turbulent floodwaters. Azil jumped in just as the large chunk of metal beneath her feet broke loose. She immediately discovered the water was now too deep for her to reach the bottom and kicked her feet around, attempting to find something to stand on. Shouts from the other Fids faded and re-emerged as her head was hammered by one powerful wave after another. Unable to stabilize herself, Azil's feet dragged along the bottom, smacking against sunken scraps of metal as the intense floodwaters pulled her along. Finally, her foot hooked on something solid below the surface, stopping her movement. Wrapping her ankle around the object, she managed to secure her body against the rushing current. When she poked her head out of the water, all she could hear were the cries of Fids all around her. Although the wind had died down, the floodwaters continued to move swiftly and unpredictably in all directions. Looking around, Azil realized she was somewhere along the edge of the swamp forest. Where exactly am I? She wondered. The heap was now nowhere in sight. Where in the swamp did that current drag me? Her eyes scanned the area for clues. Around her, debris from the storm littered the water's surface. She was relieved to see that there were dozens of Fids clinging to some of the larger floating objects, but she felt that would only be a temporary solution. The intensity of the floodwaters had continued to increase, and she knew they were still in serious danger. I hope Voda's all right, she thought. Then concerns for some of the other Fids popped into her mind. She knew Boden would know what to do, but she worried about the noobs like Jersa and Nubli. Suddenly, her eyes widened as a horrible thought struck her. Mum, where's my mother? In all the chaos, she hadn't seen her mother. Was she with the other Fids? Or Azil closed her eyes and frantically shook her head. What if she stayed home? The thought of her mother alone as their house filled with water was too much for Azil to handle. She knew she wouldn't be able to help anyone if she didn't stay positive. My mother's got to be out here somewhere, she thought, glancing around at several small groups of Fids. She could see that, although they appeared to be safe now, at any moment the flood could intensify and change everything. We need to get out of the water, she thought. It's just not safe. There's got to be a way. Azil knew she needed to come up with a solution before it was too late. She desperately wanted to help the others, but first needed to help herself. The water's depth had increased and her head was now dipping below the surface with each passing wave. She could no longer stand on the submerged object below her feet and needed something to float on. Small tree branches and vines surrounded her, but she needed to find something larger, something to keep her afloat. Then her eyes widened as she spotted a familiar large rectangular object floating nearby. A grigorade. Azil bent down and then pushed herself upward, launching her body up and out of the water. Landing next to the grigorade, she quickly wrapped her arms around its narrow side. She had only seen a couple of these large metal objects in her life, but she had no idea they could float. Azil stabilized herself on top of the grigorade, lying face down on one of its four larger, flat sides. Suddenly, she heard the shout of a familiar voice behind her. A's over here. Azil turned around and saw Voda floating on a thick grok log, struggling to move closer. Bo, you're safe? I was worried about you. Me too. We may be safe right now, but the water's still rising. I know. Hey, have you seen my mom? Voda shook her head. What about Kervol? No. Voda lifted her head to look around. They've got to be out here somewhere. Yeah, I just wish I knew they were safe. I understand. Hey, what about your brother and Gazza? Have you seen them? Yes, they're safe, said Voda, nodding and smiling. I saw them floating on a chunk of tree like this one. She firmly patted the log under her. Azil smiled. I'm glad they're okay. I just hope everyone else is. Az, we need to find a way to get everyone together and get them out of this water. That's what I was thinking, said Azil, looking around. Voda, where's the heap? As soon as I got into the water, the current dragged me away. So you didn't see? No, see what? It's gone. The whole thing just crumbled and disappeared beneath the water. Azil's jaw dropped. The entire thing, it's underwater. Yes, said Voda, nodding. But we can't think about that right now. We need to figure out a place to take everyone that's safe. What about the trees? Azil asked. I don't think we have an option. Me either. Voda shrugged, looking at the nearby trees which bordered the swamp forest. How do we get everyone up there? Suddenly, Azil had a realization. She turned away from Voda and pointed toward one of the trees on the edge of the forest. Over there. That's the tree we climbed, the one with the steel pegs. Voda shrugged. Are you sure? Yes, trust me. Well, what are we waiting for? Voda turned her head and shouted to the crowd. Everyone, listen. You need to follow us. I know a place that's safe. Azil watched as some of the Fids began to push their arms through the water, paddling in their direction. She also noticed there were others, behind them, who didn't hear the message. Azil turned to Voda and pointed to a couple groups that weren't moving in their direction. Look, I don't think those Fids back there heard you. Voda shouted to the approaching Fids, look behind you. Tell everyone to come this way. Before long, it appeared everyone had got the message. Several Fids had already reached them, with dozens more paddling in their direction. Azil could even see that some of the bigs were carrying noobs on their shoulders. Follow us. Voda shouted, motioning to the group. Where are we going? Asked one of the bigs. Instead of responding directly, Voda addressed the entire group that was gathering around them. Attention, everyone. We can't stay in the water. It's just not safe. We need to go up into the trees. The crowd gasped. Azil could see the fear in their eyes. Listen, you have to trust me, said Voda, pleading. We will all be much safer in the trees, a nervous Midi shouted back. But what about the vicious Groken? As she paddled toward the tree, Azil could hear other voices of doubt emerging within the group. Everybody listen, Voda shouted. Please believe me, the Groken does not exist. It is completely safe for us to go up into the trees, and that is what we all need to do. So come on, she quickly motioned to the group. Let's follow Azil. By this time, Azil had made it to the Grok with the steel pegs. She waited patiently beside the tree until the first group of Fids joined her. Pointing to the series of pegs which ran up the side of the tree, Azil said, Look, everyone, these will make it easy for us to get up the tree. She stepped onto the first peg and reached up to another. See, it's really easy. With everyone watching her, she continued to climb. This time, it was easy for her to get up onto the first branch. Azil looked down and noticed with some surprise the others were actually following her. She also noticed that Voda was now beside the tree, encouraging everyone to stay positive and keep moving. As Azil helped each of the Fids up onto the branch, she was relieved to see a familiar face. Mom, you're okay. Oh, Azil, I was so worried about you, said her mother, hugging her. Your brother was worried too. He told me that the giant leaf thingy was your idea. Azil lowered her head. Yes, but it didn't work out. Well, you never gave up. Azil's mother gently lifted her head. Look around, all these Fids are safe because of you. Azil stood up and noticed all the Fids she had known throughout her life. Looking at each of their faces, she began to realize how much she truly cared about each and every one of them. Fids like Noobly and even her brother obviously held a significant part in her life. Then there were others, like Amble Pramp, whom Azil never really allowed herself to get to know. She wondered what her life would have been like if she hadn't remained so distant from everyone. Looking around, seeing that they were all safe filled her with a sense of peace and satisfaction. Lost in thought, Azil barely noticed a voice calling out to her. Looking up, she noticed Boden smiling at her. Without hesitation, Azil threw her arms around him. Boden, you're okay. Me? I was worried about you. After the heat fell apart, I saw everyone else but didn't see you anywhere. She smiled. Well, you know me, not much for crowds. Boden laughed. Me either. Out of the corner of her eye, Azil noticed Voda climbing up onto the branch. Voda, over here, she shouted. As Voda ran up to them, Azil could see the concern in her eyes. Have you seen my father? Azil shrugged. No, he's not with the group. I counted all the Fids who climbed the tree. Everyone's here, except for him. Privately, Azil had mixed feelings about the man who had been lying to them all those years. And his recent attempts to sabotage her had almost cost everyone their lives, but she didn't want to waste her time thinking about how horrible Lazov was. The only thing that mattered to her in that moment was the sadness on her best friend's face. Azil smiled as she reached out for Voda's hand. Your father, he's very smart. If anyone can survive, it will be him. I'm sure he'll find a safe place to go. I hope so. He may be unbearable at times, but he's the only parent I've got left. He'll be okay. Right now we need to save these Fids. Voda shrugged. Save them? Isn't that what we just did? Azil lowered her voice so only Voda could hear her. Yes, but I'm still worried. What if the wind gets bad again or the floodwaters keep rising? I just don't know what's going to happen next, so I think I should find Lucas and ask him what he thinks we should do. Okay, Voda said, with a hint of reservation in her voice. Do you even remember how to get to Lucas's house from here? I think so. Maybe it would be best if I go talk to him myself. Voda shook her head. No, we need to talk to him. Maybe he can help us figure out what to do next. Azil shrugged. Well, how do we do this? We can't just tell everyone we're leaving to go speak to some stranger who lives in the trees. That's true, said Voda, nodding. We need to be subtle about this. Azil turned her head and noticed everyone appeared to be grouped together, sharing stories of their survival. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Voda whispered. Azil nodded. If we sneak away now, nobody will notice. Voda quietly walked out ahead and waved her on. Come on, Az, let's go see Lucas. Chapter 21. In finer droids, so all the figs are stuck in a tree. Huh. Lucas said with a grin. Voda crossed her arms and clarified. Fids. And no, they're not stuck. So what's the problem? Are they afraid the vicious Groken is going to get them? Azil shook her head. We don't have time for this. Are you going to help us? Or not? Seriously, I don't know what you expect from me. I don't have all the answers. I knew this was a mistake, said Voda, turning to leave. Wait. Lucas shouted. With her back to him, Voda stopped to listen. There's something I never got a chance to tell you about us, all of us. Maybe it will help. Azil impatiently interrupted. If you think it might help, then stop wasting our time and tell us. Voda silently turned back toward Lucas as he began to explain. Okay, then listen to me. All of us have this thing inside of us. Lucas looked down and tapped on his chest. It's an internal thermostat called a Morval core. Azil narrowed her eyes. Wait, a Morval what? Sorry, this isn't easy to explain. Lucas rubbed his head and paced around for a moment. Depending on the intensity of the sun or glow, our bodies change temperature. Basically, we start to heat up. But this only happens when the sun's energy hits our metal bodies directly. That doesn't make any sense, Azil said. I'm always out in the glow and I've never heated up. Lucas shook his head. That's just it. Down there in the swamp, none of you can ever experience the sun directly because it's constantly being filtered through that nasty greenish haze. Voda impatiently interrupted. What does any of this have to do with the thing inside us, the thermocore or whatever? Morval core, said Lucas, rolling his eyes. You two have spent your entire lives, many lives down there in that swamp. You have literally been stuck in a perpetual haze where the brilliance of the sun and everything else has been kept from you. We get it, said Azil, pleading. Can you just get to the point? Yeah, I don't understand. Something inside of us changes. Voda asked. Yes, but it's hard to explain. Well, can you at least try? Azil impatiently tapped her foot on the wet branch. But only if it's really important. Important, Lucas said with a laugh. He put his hands on his hips and looked toward the sky. It's like a bird who's never flown asking if wings are important. Yes, it's important. Unfortunately, it's something you'd have to experience to understand. Experience? Voda asked. Like catching groppers. Lucas shrugged. Groppers? Is that a disease? Azil ignored his last remark, hoping to speed things up. How do you know whatever this mysterious experience is we haven't already experienced it? Trust me, you haven't. Nobody in your society has, well, at least not recently. How are you so sure? Voda asked. I just know. Okay, and I already explained that the experience I'm talking about cannot occur down there in that stupid swamp. Azil shook her head and stomped her foot, shaking the branch under their feet. What are you talking about? This is the most pointless conversation ever. Voda looked at Lucas, shrugging. Why do you keep talking about the swamp and the green hazy glow like they're such a bad thing? Because they are. They're what's keeping all of you from the truth. The truth? Asked Azil. Then what was all that stuff you told me? The video that was our collective history, Lucas replied. What I'm talking about now is something personal to every single one of us, something that Lazov has denied all of you by limiting your world to the swamp. Azil shrugged. So what was he keeping from us? What was Lazov so afraid we'd discover? Voda stepped in front of Azil and angrily pushed Lucas back. Just tell us. If you know something, tell us. What is this big secret my father's been keeping from everyone? Morval Grust, Lucas said. Your father didn't want you all to rediscover your Morval Grust. I don't understand, said Azil, shaking her head. None of this is making any sense. Obviously, Lucas put his hands on his head and looked down at his feet. How do I explain this? He said to himself. Then he began to pace back and forth on the branch, but came to an abrupt stop. All right, you just need to see for yourself. He looked up through the trees. Good, looks like the sky's clearing up. Come on, you two follow me. He started walking, but stopped when he realized they hadn't moved. Azil was beginning to think this was all a waste of time. She knew everyone was relying on her and didn't want to let them down. Lucas, we don't have time for this. We need to get back to the Fids, said Azil, pointing back in the direction they had come. He lowered his shoulders. Come on, what I want to show you is really important. It's everything. If you two are ever going to trust me, now would be the time. Azil threw her arms up in surrender. All right, let's make it quick. Voda nodded. Yes, this better be good. They proceeded to follow Lucas deeper into the forest until they came to what looked to be another one of his elaborate metal constructions. At first, Azil thought it might be another one of his strange music machines. Like the Scalatron, it wrapped around an enormous groke. But there was something oddly familiar about this thing. It wasn't until Lucas stepped onto it that Azil understood. Is this some kind of staircase, she asked. That's right, Lucas said, glancing upward. The tall kind. It's called a spiral staircase. I guess you built this too. Yeah. He started to climb and looked back. I thought you two were in a hurry. Let's go, he hastily motioned to them as he continued to climb. Azil stepped onto the first step and held onto the railing. She looked up and noticed the stairs seemed to disappear into the haze. That's a long way up. Are you sure this is important? Azil asked. He stared at her and gave an exasperated sigh. Trust me, it is very important. Well, go on, lead the way, said Voda with a nod. Lucas turned and they began to follow him up the spiral staircase. By this time, the wind and rain had subsided and the clamor of their metal feet echoed through the forest as they climbed. Up and around the giant tree they went. Azil could not believe the magnitude of his creation. She imagined there must have been hundreds of steps. How in the swamp did he make this all by himself? She wondered. Suddenly, Azil's vision began to deteriorate. Hey, what's going on? Asked Azil, waving her arms in front of her face. I can barely see where I'm going. Relax, it's only the haze, replied Lucas. Voda smacked Lucas on his back. Where exactly are you taking us? He turned around, grabbed Voda by the shoulders, and stared into her eyes. I'm taking you to my leader, the Great Glow. Lucas burst into laughter. Voda grinned and punched him in the chest. Very funny. Seriously, where are we going? Hold on, we're almost there. As they approached the top of the staircase, the haze began to dissipate. Azil could finally see clearly again, but something was different. She was experiencing a level of clarity unlike ever before. Everything seemed to be more detailed and vibrant. She looked down in wonder, noticing the bright metallic surface of her arms shining through patches of swamp residue. The metal of the staircase also shimmered and sparkled in a way she had never seen. As they stepped off the staircase, she immediately shielded her eyes from an unfamiliar intensity. Once her eyes adjusted, the world around her appeared to have transformed. The murky greenish sky she had always known was now a brilliant blue. Turning her head, Azil noticed the source of the intensity, a tiny luminous point in the sky. That is the sun, the source of what you've been calling the Great Glow, Lucas said. He then looked at Voda, who was gazing off into the distance. There's a lot more to explore than you thought, right? Voda scanned the horizon, her eyes wide with wonder. Is this the entire swamp? More than that. The world you live in goes on, and on way past the swamp, there are oceans, deserts, mountains, forests, and everything in between. With every word Lucas said, Azil became more and more agitated. Can you please stop doing that? What are you talking about? We don't understand you when you use all those strange words. Sorry, I keep forgetting that you two have been living in Lazov's bubble, he said, rolling his eyes. I'll try to keep it simple. Voda narrowed her eyes. Can you just leave my father out of this? She then turned her back to him and took in the view. Lucas stood next to her and pointed toward the horizon. See that part of the sky where it's not as bright? Yeah, I was wondering, why is it like that? That's the hurricane. That's what caused all the wind and flooding. Voda's eyes widened. Wow, the three of them now stood on a large metal platform which extended out in all directions. On any normal day, Azil would have thoroughly explored and examined the amazing structure. But in that moment, all she could think about was getting back to help the others. Lucas turned to Azil and looked her up and down while slowly shaking his head. What? She said, holding out her arms and looking down at the patches of dried mud on her body. You got a problem with a little mud. Actually, he popped open his bubbit and pulled out several pobs. Lucas, please tell me you're joking. Azil looked at Voda. Did you put him up to this? I had nothing to do with it, she said, trying to hold back from laughing, but it is kind of funny. Look, Azil, I'm not trying to be funny or insulting. Just trust me. Still holding the pobs. Lucas stretched out his arm toward her. She grabbed them from his hand and firmly rubbed them against her body. For your sake, you better not be messing with me, she said, looking up to glare at him. But he was no longer facing her. She watched him with an air of suspicion as he silently walked away from them. Where is he going? She wondered, shaking her head. With his back to them, he continued out, into the center of the platform beyond the shade of the tree's canopy. His ardent body began to glimmer as it reflected the sun's intensity. Azil squinted as she stared at Lucas impatiently. She then shouted, "Can we get back to the reason we climbed all the way up here?" "Yes, Morval Grust," said Lucas, motioning to them. "If you guys want to experience this, you're going to have to step out of the shadow." He pointed to the darker area of the platform where they were standing. Now Azil understood why he had walked away from the tree, but what he did next made absolutely no sense to her. Lucas stretched his arms out wide and faced the sun. "What are you doing?" shouted Azil, narrowing her eyes. He reached around and pointed to his upper back. Inside this compartment, there is something called a Morval core. Although it is a physical object, it holds the non-physical aspect of yourself, your eternal essence or Morval. "So that little door on my back, that's where my Morval core is." Lucas nodded. "And it can be taken out." Azil's eyes widened. "So that's what the disc is for?" "Yes, the Morval disc is the key." "Literally," he said with a grin. "Is that how we're able to have different bodies?" Azil asked. "Exactly. The Morval core is transferred to a new body at the beginning of each of the 3 phases of your life. This is to simulate the growth we experienced as humans. And that's how I was able to grow since the first time you saw me." He smiled at Azil. "Thanks to your lock-picking lesson, I was able to get this body back so I don't have to be a stupid MIDI anymore." "No offense, you changed the core by yourself?" Azil asked. "Yes, and it wasn't easy." Lucas turned to Voda. "Since your father took over, he's had the responsibility to keep up this illusion of growth. Sometimes he gets someone to help him out, usually within his family, but he always swears them to secrecy." Azil's eyes widened. "Bowden, that would explain why he's been acting so weird." "You think my brother knows about all this?" Voda asked. "He has to know. His workshop, I didn't want to tell you this, Voda, but I went in there and saw some really strange things." Voda looked at Lucas and tilted her head. "Are you saying my brother is like my father and you? You mean immortal?" "Not quite. He's just like you, except with this tremendous burden of secrecy. Thanks to your father. So every year, every festival of the Great Glow, my father takes some of the Fid's Morval cores out and puts them into different bodies." Voda shook her head. "It doesn't make any sense. How is it nobody sees this?" "Oh, the secret," said Lucas, smiling at Voda. "You want to know how he does it?" He then turned to Azil. "What about you? Do you know how he's able to change everyone's bodies without anyone noticing?" She thought for a moment. Then her eyes grew wide. "The blindness, that's why he wanted us to fear the blindness, so we'd idle every night." Voda looked at Lucas and shrugged. "Is that true?" "The only reason we idle is so my father can switch our cores without anyone knowing." He nodded. "It's similar to how I did it, except I didn't make up scary lies that had everyone idling 1/3 of their lives away." "How long has my father been doing all this?" Let's see, he rubbed his chin slowly. "I have been living alone for, I guess it's been about 26,000 years now." Azil couldn't believe what she was hearing. For 26,000 years, he has been keeping this secret and making up all these lies. "But don't you see, Az, he almost had to," Voda said. "He had to lie? Why? Seriously, I don't understand." Lucas nodded in agreement. "It's true. When he got rid of me, he did it because he wanted immortality and power. And with that, he inherited the tremendous responsibility of keeping up the illusion of the human experience. This meant he had to make everyone believe that life had a beginning and an end." "I get it," Azil said. "He made it look like we were growing by secretly putting our Morval cores into different bodies. But that still doesn't explain all his other lies. Again, that's where he and I differed. Lazov felt the only way he could empower himself was by disempowering everyone else. I was never like him. I never desired power over anyone. All I've ever wanted was to empower." Voda put her hands on her head as she voiced her confusion. "How have you been empowering us? You've been silent this whole time, hiding up here in the trees, while my father's been making up all these lies. How are you any better than him? Keeping the truth from someone is no different than lying." "Maybe," said Lucas, turning his head. "I never should have let him, but you did," said Azil. "And this was originally your responsibility. You were supposed to look out for us. Don't you think I tried? But when Lazov took over, everything changed." "Exactly. How did my father take over, anyway?" "Originally, as the historian and living record of our true history, it was not only my duty to carry the history of our society, I was also given the burden of carrying on the illusion of the life cycle for everyone else. We understand that, said Azil, impatiently tapping her foot. What about Lazov? I'm getting to that. Lukas paused for a moment and grinned uncomfortably. For the first 18,000 years of our existence, we had created an ideal society and rebuilt our world just like we planned. Everything was great until Lazov decided to ruin everything. He wasn't satisfied with the world we had created and had his own idea of a perfect society, one that was all about him. This didn't happen right away because everyone knew our history and true power. It took him thousands of years, but eventually he got rid of all evidence of the past. The entire culture of our civilization was systematically and methodically erased by my father. Are you telling me my father was responsible for doing that? Voda shook her head. I don't believe it. How? I know it must be difficult to hear, but trust me, it was all your father's doing. Are you sure you want to hear the details? Voda nodded. Just tell me. Lazov started by convincing everyone they no longer needed to learn. It took some time, but eventually he phased out education. After a while, nobody even knew the basics like reading, math and science. This caused the use of written language to fade more and more with each generation. Books became unintelligible and were eventually destroyed. Science and technology were deemed too complicated. The whole concept of art had become too confusing and any remaining art was destroyed. But as much as Lazov tried, he couldn't suppress the one major threat to his power, and that was the innate sense of individual purpose that we were each created with. It wasn't until his decision to relocate everyone to the swamp that he was able to put the finishing touches on his own ideal fantasy world. Zovia. Lukas rolled his eyes in disgust and turned away. And what a wonderful place that has become. Azil was stunned. That's unbelievable. There's one thing I still don't understand, said Voda, shrugging. Way back thousands of years ago, how did my father even discover he could bypass the cycle and become immortal? Wasn't it your job to keep this big secret from everyone? Yes, it was my job. But there's something you should understand about your father. Back then, he was very different from the others. Throughout each of his cycles, he demonstrated a consistently high level of intelligence, but I underestimated how smart he really was. Lazov was always intensely curious and very determined. During one of his cycles, his curiosity began at an especially early age. By the time he was a middy, he had begun to notice strange inconsistencies within the world around him. Unfortunately, I was unaware of how much he had discovered, including the growing suspicion he had of me. He must have secretly observed me for years, long enough to discover that the 36-year life cycle didn't exactly apply to me. After that, it was only a matter of time before he figured out a way to override the lie of the cycle and become immortal. Azil couldn't believe what she was hearing. So how did he do it? She asked inquisitively. At the time, I wasn't quite sure how he did it, but now I have a fairly good idea, one that I'll be keeping to myself for now. But I will tell you this, if I am correct, it's also reversible. Voda's eyes widened. So technically, my father could have the process reversed? Yes. Of course, if this happened, he would completely forget about all of this, even you. Lazov would start over just like everyone does as a noob. That is crazy, said Voda, shaking her head in disbelief. Although Azil was intrigued by all the new information, her thoughts kept returning to the rest of the Fids who were still in danger. Lukas, does any of this have to do with why we came up here, the Morval Grust or whatever? Azil impatiently looked back to the stairs. Let's hurry this up so Voda and I can get back down there and help everyone. Sorry, I almost forgot. Okay, so as I was saying, that compartment in your back holds your Morval core, which is the key to this whole process. By stimulating this core, we'll be able to activate our Morval Grust and then... Azil interrupted. Okay, we understand. Let's get to the demonstration. Okay, now watch me. Lukas turned toward the sun and began to instruct them. Face the sun and do what I'm doing. First, stretch your arms out wide. Now lean back. Are you both following along? They agreed and began to mimic the pose. Azil didn't see the logic of this strange pose and began to feel awkward. Seriously, this is stupid. What's the point? Keep holding it just like this, Lukas said softly. And do you feel the Morval Grust beginning to activate? No, said Azil, fidgeting. We don't have time for this. She put her arms down and turned back toward the staircase. This is ridiculous. Come on, Voda. We need to figure out what to do now that our entire village is up in a tree. Vo, are you coming? As Azil turned back to see her friend, what she saw both amazed and humbled her. Where Voda and Lukas had stood were two different, yet somehow familiar, metal beings. Their highly polished bodies included intricate patterns and complex forms, Suddenly, a high-pitched metallic buzzing sound began to emanate from their bodies, and the platform below Azil's feet began to vibrate. She couldn't understand what was happening. After a moment, the vibrating stopped, but the buzzing sound continued. Azil's mouth dropped as the two unidentifiable beings lifted into the air and hovered above the platform. Her mind was racing with questions. Where are? Is that? Could it be? Azil didn't know what to think or even feel. She wasn't sure if she was amazed or terrified. Seeing these bizarre metal beings miraculously floating in the air was challenging her limited understanding of what was possible. Is this what Lucas meant by Morval Grust, she wondered. Could it have changed them into Azil had to know what was going on? She was nearly afraid to say a word, but found herself involuntarily speaking to one of them. Voda, Azil said hesitantly. She listened carefully, but heard no response. All she could hear was the metallic buzzing sound. She tried again, this time a little louder. Voda, is that you? Azil waited patiently for a reply. Eventually, the smaller one responded with an equally unsure, I think so. The other hovering metal being reassured both of them. Azil met the new and improved Voda. Azil recognized the voice. It was Lucas. Her eyes widened. What? What happened to you two? Lucas laughed. The same thing that would have happened to you if you weren't so impatient. We became even more awesome. Is this what you meant by Morval Grust? Azil asked. Yes, this is what happens when your Morval Grust is fully activated. Azil felt she was missing something. This is amazing, but I don't understand why Lazov thought this was something he needed to hide from everyone. That's just it, he said. This is something you could never fully understand without experiencing it for yourself. Voda, who continued to hover next to Lucas, spoke softly. He's right, Aze. If I could only explain to you how I feel right now, Lucas turned to Voda. Right, you can't put it into words, can you? To live over 1,000 lifetimes and not know this feeling. This power, Voda said solemnly, makes you angry, doesn't it? He asked. No, it makes me sad. Sad for all those years of needless worry, needless struggle. Not just for me, for all of us. Lucas gently held Voda's hand. You didn't know. How were any of you supposed to know that you were only experiencing such a small percentage of your potential? Azil's eyes grew wide with a sudden realization. Infinidroids. Now it makes sense. Yes, Infinidroids. Aze, what are you waiting for? Voda asked. Azil stepped into the center of the platform and faced the sun. With her arms outstretched, she slowly began to feel something unusual. A slow vibration had begun deep within her core and became a buzzing sensation, which quickly spread throughout her body. Suddenly, Azil realized she was no longer standing on the platform, but hovering slightly above it. A level of excitement she had never experienced before caught her by surprise. This is awesome. I've always felt this drive to do things, but it's never been this strong. I feel like I can do anything. Voda was also bursting with excitement. I know, this feeling, it's hard to explain. It's like I suddenly have this intense desire to do something, to run, to explore, to discover. Exactly, but mine is an intense desire to create, to make things. My whole life I've always considered myself to be passionate about what I do, but now, this is incredible. Lucas grinned. Just wait until you rediscover your abilities. Talk about incredible. Azil became fascinated as she looked over her newly transformed body. It was like a highly complex instrument she was seeing for the first time. Moving points of energy and glowing buttons were mapped out in a logical sequence, which ran the length of her arms. She continued to observe with a sense of wonder. What is all this? She looked up and noticed Voda's arms appeared to be different and less complex. I don't understand. Why do we look so different? Why are her arms longer? And why do mine have so many buttons? Think about it, Lucas said. We were created with the intent to rebuild, to create a new society. To do that, each of us chose the thing we love to do most. I had always been fascinated by studying and understanding what came before. This meant I would have to become the living record of our society. Voda, see that button near your left hand? She looked down and noticed a green button, which was slowly pulsing. Go ahead, push it, he said. Voda hesitantly pushed the button. Who? This is Azil watched curiously, but didn't notice anything different. What? What is it? Voda, tell her what you see. Voda looked confused. I don't understand any of this. I am seeing everything around me, but it's different. There are lines and images drawn over everything. Some of them even change as I move my head around. Think about it. What are you? What do you love to do more than anything else? He asked. Oh, said Voda, grinning. Now I understand. These lines and symbols must be for navigational use to help me know where I'm going. Lucas nodded his head. Yes, that and much more. Just like I carry the knowledge of our past within me. You are literally a living map of our world. So I have a map of the entire swamp within me, Voda asked. Lucas laughed to himself. What's so funny? Asked Azil. Our world, he said as he rotated his body around slowly and looked off into the distance. This is our world. It's huge. Azil saw what he was pointing to, which didn't look like much to her. But the swamp, that's huge, she said. Once again, Lucas laughed to himself. He reached down and picked up a leaf, which rested on the platform. See this? Imagine this leaf is the swamp, the entire swamp. Now imagine this enormous tree is the world. Are you beginning to understand? Voda's eyes widened. A map of all this entire world is somewhere inside of me. Yes, but that's only the beginning, said Lucas, addressing both of them. By fully activating your Morval Grust, you have both regained access to abilities and information which had been lying dormant within you for a very long time. Most of it you won't understand at first, but over time it will gradually make more sense. Azil quickly scanned her new body again. I don't understand any of this. What do all these buttons do? Lucas shrugged. How should I know? They may have something to do with the fact that you like to invent and repair things. Push one, see what happens. Azil noticed a long, thin line which ran down her left arm and terminated at a button on her wrist. She cautiously pushed the button, but was not prepared for what happened. A blue flame instantly shot out of the index finger of the same hand. She intuitively pressed the button again, which stopped the flame. Awesome. Where was that earlier when I was making? Azil suddenly remembered the reason they went to find Lucas. The flood. I almost forgot. His eyes widened. Yes, you two need to get back and help the others. You think they're still in danger? Voda asked. Definitely. Even though the storm's passed, the floodwaters will continue to rise. Azil motioned to Voda. Come on, we need to get going. Lucas slowly lowered himself to the platform and realized Azil and Voda were still hovering. Well, what are you two waiting for? It would probably help if you explained to us how to get down, said Voda, moving her feet around in midair. Yeah, we're kind of in a hurry, Azil said with a grin. Lucas laughed. Oh, sorry. I forgot this was all new to you. What you want to do is flex your feet and point them upward. Azil quickly pointed her feet up and fell directly downward onto her, but slowly, shouted Lucas, motioning with his arms. Now, sitting on the platform, Azil looked up to see her friend slowly and gracefully descend. Show off? Voda smiled. No, I'm just more patient than you. That's true. Azil stood up and turned to Lucas. Do you want to come with us? He shook his head. I don't think that's such a good idea. Seeing me now would only confuse them. But they need to know the truth, Azil said. I agree, but it needs to come from you two first. When they are ready, I will share the details about their true history. Azil and Voda walked to the stairs to begin the long journey down, but stopped when they heard Lucas call after them. Aren't you two forgetting something? Shrugging simultaneously, Azil and Voda turned to face each other and immediately burst into laughter when they saw the unfamiliar face staring back at them. This might be a problem, Voda said. Azil turned to Lucas. How do we? Here, watch me. Just do what I do. He slowly crouched down and rested on one knee. You'll need to hold this position for a moment. They both watched in awe as his body appeared to vibrate, then liquefy, melting and morphing into its previous form. And that's it, Lucas said confidently as he stood up. There are a couple other things that you should know before you leave. If you ever need to reactivate when you're down there, just look for areas where the sun's intensity is able to penetrate through the trees. It doesn't take much. And oh, if you want to try something fun, he said with a grin. When you're hovering, try pointing your feet down instead of up. Azil and Voda glanced at each other, then looked back at Lucas. Point our feet down when we're in the air, said Azil, nudging her friend. We'll have to remember that. She turned back to Lucas. Thanks for the tip and everything else. Voda waved. Thanks, Lucas. The two friends stepped back onto the massive winding staircase and began the long walk down. Chapter 22. Banished. Azil couldn't believe what they had just experienced. What she had discovered about herself was both overwhelming and exciting, and she knew Voda felt the same. With what they had gone through, she felt everything was about to change. It had to. There was no way they'd go back to living with Lazov's lies. Azil imagined what it would be like once all the others learned the truth. No more fears, no more doubts, no more worries, and definitely no more unconventional, she thought, smiling. She hoped that day would come, but saving the others would have to come first. The path of branches back through the swamp forest was beginning to dry up now that the storm had passed. The sun filtered through the cracks between the growth leaves, causing the path before them to glisten. Leading the way, Azil estimated they were now about half the distance back to where they started. While hurrying to get back to the other Fids, Azil and Voda used the time to formulate a plan to save their society from the threat of rising floodwaters. Having a clear idea, the two of them knew exactly what needed to be done. Azil's only concern was whether or not they'd be too late. This creeping doubt caused her to increase their pace as she quickly hopped onto another branch. "You sure you remember the way back?" asked Voda, trying to keep up. As they ran, Azil darted down the path of branches to their left. "I think it's this way." Before they went any farther, she stopped abruptly, noticing movement up ahead. "Look," she said, pointing through the maze of branches. "Did you see that?" "No, what?" Voda stopped and looked carefully. "Someone is coming this way." From a distance, Azil could see a shimmering metal body moving rapidly across a long branch. Her excitement switched to dread as she realized who it was. Voda squinted as she peered through the trees. "Is that my father?" "Yes," Azil said with an exasperated sigh. "And it looks like he's coming this way." Azil's first instinct was to turn and run in the opposite direction, but this didn't happen. In that moment, she realized she would never run from Lozov, anyone or anything ever again. Fear was a delusion she had lived with long enough. She now understood that the part of her that mattered, her Morval, was both powerful and eternal. She calmly stood by her friend as Lozov approached. "My sweet Voda, I have been looking all over for you," he said, taking her hand. "I was worried." "There's nothing to worry about. I'm fine," she said, coldly withdrawing her hand. "Where have you been all this time?" he asked. "With my best friend." "Is that so?" Lozov asked, shooting a glance at Azil. "Yes, we were working on a plan," Voda replied. "A plan?" He turned his head and slowly rubbed his chin. "Interesting." Voda crossed her arms and glared at him. "Yes, we were working on a plan to save everyone. Something a leader should be doing." He took a step back and looked at his daughter. "Sweetie, why are you talking like that? You're starting to sound like a downer." Lozov looked away from Voda and gazed lazily at Azil. His presence was making her feel nauseous. "And you," he said, "was all this your idea? First you try to take my daughter away, then you drag her up here." Azil was about to respond, but Voda jumped in and began pointing at Lozov angrily. "She does not control me, just like you do not control me. Azil and I came up here looking for a solution to save everyone. Now we are going back to do just that. If you're not going to help, then just get out of our way." Voda stomped past her father without looking back. Lozov didn't follow his daughter. Instead, he reached out and firmly grabbed Azil by the shoulder. Staring directly into her eyes, he whispered, "I've had enough of your meddling." He then let go of Azil's shoulder and pointed to her as he started walking backward. "From now on, you are banned from Zovia. Do not follow us." He then turned and began walking toward his daughter. Stunned by Lozov's outrageous behavior, Azil remained frozen. Standing there, she thought about the situation and laughed to herself. "Lozov honestly thinks I feel threatened by him. Azil may have feared him in the past, but not anymore." She knew that all his power was an illusion based on lies. Looking farther along the path, she noticed Voda had stopped. "Is you coming?" she said, turning back. Azil shook her head. "Sorry, Vo, I can't." "What do you mean you can't?" said Voda, glaring at her. "I'm not allowed." Azil shrugged and a slight grin appeared on her face. Voda's glare shifted from Azil to her father. "It's true, Voda," Lozov said solemnly. Her utter disregard for the Arfignakal spirit. Voda held up her hands and shouted, "Quiet." Lozov stood perfectly still and silent. "I was talking to Azil." Voda's eyes shifted back to her friend. "Are you coming or not? I told you your dad won't let me." Azil giggled as she continued. "He said I've been banned." "What?" shouted Voda, marching back toward them. Lozov turned to face his daughter. "I'm sorry, but she's right. I see what a bad influence she's been on you, and I don't want her to bring the entire village down with her." Voda angrily shook her head. "No, you see someone who knows you, the real you, and that scares you." "Well, guess what? I know your secret too." Lozov turned and pointed to Azil. "Whatever she told you, she's a liar." Voda's voice softened. "Dad, stop trying to blame Azil for everything. It's you. All this time I trusted you. I stood up for you." He looked confused. "What are you talking about?" I know about Morval, Grust, everything. You've kept the truth from everyone for far too long." Lozov froze, his eyes widening. "Az and I are going to see if we can help everyone. Dad, are you going to join us or stay here and remain useless?" "Wait, you can't go." He ran up to his daughter and firmly grabbed her by the arms. Voda tried to pull her arms free, but couldn't. Stop! What are you doing? He looked into her eyes, pleading earnestly, just don't, Dad, let go of me. Voda pulled her arms back, struggling to free herself. What do you mean, just don't? Just don't? What? Please don't, he cried, pulling on his daughter's arms. Don't tell them, seriously? Your fids are in danger, and all you can think about is yourself. Voda angrily pulled her arms back, freeing herself, while Azil stumbled backwards. He fell hard and skidded across the wet branch, then tumbled over the side. Dad! Screamed Voda, running to the edge. Azil joined her as they both looked down, but neither of them saw him. All they could see, besides layers and layers of branches, was the turbulent floodwaters far below. Azil looked into her friend's eyes. We should go after him. Voda frowned and shook her head slowly. If I did, I would be just like him, choosing my needs over what's best for our society. We can look for him after everyone else is safe. Come on, Voda led the way and Azil followed. Chapter 23. The Empowered. Since Azil had slightly more experience navigating through the trees, Voda let her take the lead. Looking down, she could see that the floodwaters had risen significantly since they left the group. We need to hurry, said Azil, hopping onto an adjacent branch which forked to the right. So this looks like the way back to the village. The path before them was clear and straight, leading along an enormous branch. Because its surface was wider, she felt safe to sprint as fast as her feet could carry her. Azil knew, no matter how fast she ran, Voda's long legs would have no problem keeping pace. She swiftly continued along the branch until she became aware that something was off. The thunderous clonking of their metal feet against the wood had decreased significantly. Azil quickly realized she was only hearing one set of feet, her own. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed that Voda was no longer following her. Azil came to a stop and turned around to see Voda standing along the edge of the branch, peering down into the floodwaters below. Concerned, she quickly ran back to check on her friend. We're almost there, what's wrong? Voda turned to Azil and lowered her head. It's my father, I can't help but think he's in danger. I'm worried the flood may have taken him somewhere far away. Azil imagined a world without Lazov, which didn't seem like such a bad thing, but he was her best friend's father. It's really up to you what you want to do. What am I talking about? Replied Voda, shaking her head. There are 73 others who need our help. I agree, said Azil, nodding. Once everyone's safe, we can go back to look for your father. Motioning with her head, she urged Voda to rejoin her. Come on, let's get going. With Voda following her again, Azil continued to lead the way through the forest. She knew they had been gone a while and feared the rising water may have trapped the others on the branch, or worse, washed them back into the turbulent currents. A renewed sense of urgency fueled her desire to reach them before it was too late. As she darted down another long branch, Azil began to recognize her surroundings. Subtle details from her previous trips to see Lucas appeared to stand out, guiding her on. She noticed subtle anomalies in the shapes of branches and specific imperfections in certain trees. Approaching a growth which exhibited a prominent sprunket-shaped knot, Azil quickly recalled the proper path. This way, we're almost there, she said confidently, veering sharply to her left. Just as they hopped onto a new branch, Azil became aware of a small group of fids standing on a nearby branch. Is that? Bowden, shouted Voda, making her own path along an adjacent branch which led to her brother. Azil followed, pushing small leaf-covered branches to the side as she made her way to the group. Voda ran to her brother and gave him a hug. I'm glad you're safe. You too, Bowden said, nodding. He then noticed Azil and smiled. Good to see you're okay. I was worried about you. He turned back to Voda and shrugged. I've been worried about both of you. Where were you all this time? It's a long story, Voda said. We can explain it to you later. She glanced at the small group, then back to her brother. Bowden, where's everybody else? He motioned to the group. We tried to help. We tried to get them out of there. But what? Voda said impatiently. The others weren't able to make it up this far. Bowden's eyes grew wide. And the village? What's wrong with the village? Azil asked. He slowly lowered his head. It's us. Voda stared at her brother. What do you mean it's gone? Bowden lifted his head and looked his sister directly in the eye. Our village is completely gone. From that tree where we were standing, everyone could see the destruction. The strong currents just pulled our houses up from the growth roots and ripped them apart. Azil shook her head frantically. Forget about the village. What about the others? We need to go back and help them. Yeah, she's right, Voda said. Are the others still in danger? Bowden nodded. When we left, the water was still rising, and it was almost to where they were standing. Voda looked around the group, then raised her voice so that everyone could hear. It looks like we have including Azil and I-11 FIDs. She gave a strong, confident nod. I think that's enough. For what? Bowden asked. What do you think? Voda turned back to the group and raised her voice. Who's ready to go back down there and rescue the others? Azil quickly scanned the reactions within the group and noticed a deep sense of dread on their faces. Their wide, fear-filled eyes did not give her confidence. She wondered what Voda had seen in them. How does she expect these cowards to save anyone? She thought. She calmly walked over to Voda and whispered in her ear. Look at them. They are so scared. They don't look like they're ready to save anyone. Voda whispered back to her. Watch this. She winked at Azil, then turned back toward the group and raised her voice. There's nothing to be afraid of. You all made it this far. Voda took another look at everyone. Looks like we've got a strong group here. There's no reason why we can't save everyone. The others need us. They're relying on us. Azil noticed that Voda's words had little effect and whispered to her. Doesn't look like they're buying it. Got anything else? Voda rolled her eyes and turned back to the group. This is ridiculous. What are you all so afraid of? If you all had any idea, what are you talking about? Asked Bowden, shrugging. Any idea about what? Without another word, Voda walked away from the group. Azil tilted her head to one side as she watched her friend slowly walk out to the end of a long branch. What is she doing? Azil wondered. Then she noticed it. A clear path up through the trees had allowed an intense beam of the sun's energy to illuminate the area. As Voda reached the end of the branch, her metallic body glimmered. At that moment, Azil knew exactly what her friend was doing. Vo, are you sure? What about the plan? Voda remained silent and gazed upward. Azil knew this was at the moment everything would change. She curiously watched the group's reaction as her friend spread her arms wide. Everyone remained entranced and completely silent, except for Bowden. He appeared to be fidgeting uncontrollably. Voda, what are you doing? He asked impatiently. Again, there was no response. Azil watched in amazement as Voda slowly began to transform. The iridium alloy composition of her body appeared to change as the metal contracted and expanded before her eyes. There was something hypnotizing about this which caused Azil to temporarily disregard the reaction of the group. Suddenly, she was jolted back into awareness by the intense outward vibration which emanated from Voda's new form. Leaves broke loose as the sturdy branch below their feet shook with great intensity. When Azil redirected her focus back to the members of the group surrounding her, she realized several of them had silently slipped away, while those who remained displayed a blend of facial expressions, which ranged from confusion to absolute horror. She watched nervously as eyes darted, bodies quivered, and mouths mumbled unidentifiable sounds, all of them completely unaware they were witnessing the most empowering moment of their lives. Azil threw her hands in the air, attempting to get everyone's attention. It's all right, everyone. It's Voda. Now hovering slightly, Voda turned toward the group. She's right. It's just me with a few upgrades. Bowden stood and stared at his sister, wide-eyed. What is? I can't believe, he mumbled in confusion. Azil could see by his reaction that, despite all the secrets he had known about, this wasn't one. With a calm sincerity, Voda spoke to the group. I know this is all very strange and confusing to all of you, and I can explain it later, but now we need to work together to save the others. What I can tell you all now is that each of us are much more powerful than we have believed. Every one of us has our own unique set of abilities. We are going to need these abilities today, but more importantly, we are all going to need to be bold and courageous. The destiny of our society depends on us, what we choose to do today. With each word Voda said, Azil noticed the confidence on their faces spread and increase. She considered speaking, but realized anything she might say in that moment could be counterproductive. Instead, she proudly watched her friend continue to speak. If you are having any doubts that you can do this, if you are having any doubts that you can be a hero, those doubts are about to disappear. Voda smiled and gave Azil a wink. Azil recognized this as the cue to implement her role in their plan. She returned the smile as she walked past her friend and stepped into the narrow shaft of energy. Now, fully immersed in the sun's glowing intensity, she began to feel that familiar surge run through her body. There were a couple things Azil and Voda had discovered on their journey back from seeing Lucas. As a result of activating their Morval Grust for a second time, Azil learned that in addition to the blowtorch, she had access to a spinning saw blade. But the most significant discovery came from Voda, who tried Lucas's suggestion of pointing her feet downward. When she did this, her body immediately launched straight up into the air. After a little practice, Voda was able to fly with ease. Now that discovery would come into play as they began the next phase of their plan. With the full activation of her Morval Grust, Azil began to hover above the branch. Reaching across her body with her left arm, she gently pressed a small round button on her right wrist. Suddenly, a continuous high-pitched screeching sound emanated from her body and echoed through the trees. The small group froze in fear, then gasped as a whirling blade shot out of her right arm. Azil pointed her feet toward the branch beneath her, and her body shot upward, through the tree's canopy. Up in the sky, beyond the dense leaves and branches, she could no longer see the small group in the forest below. Turning her head upward, all she could see was the tiny brilliant orb suspended in the clear blue sky. The sun, she thought, marveling at its intensity. With her blades still buzzing, Azil returned to the forest canopy. She started from the very top of the trees and continued downward as she cut branch after branch. Leaves and wood rained down through the trees. As she continued to clear a path through the forest canopy, a surge of powerful energy from the sun was able to penetrate deeper, illuminating the entire area. Azil could now clearly see the small group standing far below as their bodies began to glisten and shimmer. She watched as Voda calmly instructed everyone to spread their arms wide and look upward. As they quietly followed her instructions, Azil slowly descended to witness their transformation. She was amazed by what she saw. Now each of them looked completely different with their own unique design. Azil saw mysterious components and unknown buttons for abilities she could only imagine. Noticing Voda and her newly transformed brother, Azil softly landed next to them. She could see the wonder in Boden's eyes. "What is going on? Is this real?" he asked. Azil nodded. "Very real. What happened to us?" Boden asked, looking down at his new body. Voda smiled at him. "You became what you've always been, but were unaware of an infinidroid." "We're all infinidroids," Azil said as she continued to admire all of their fascinating new forms. Voda nodded, then spoke to the group. "Who's ready to find out just how awesome you really are?" Azil and Voda proceeded to give a brief introductory lesson to the rest of the group. In doing this, they also learned a few things. Azil noticed that, besides everyone's ability to fly, their other abilities were quite diverse. One of the infinidroids was able to extrude a tool for digging, while another could shoot steel cables out of her fingertips. These abilities were apparent to everyone. But there were other, less obvious abilities. Boden, for example, seemed to have some sort of numerical overlay, which allowed him to understand the distances between objects. Some of the other infinidroids also mentioned words and other sounds that only they could hear. Azil imagined these audible overlays might have something to do with being able to recall the names of unknown objects and substances, although she wasn't exactly sure. After the infinidroids became acquainted with the basics of their own unique abilities, Voda and Azil gave a quick demonstration of what they had learned so far about flying, and within a short period of time, everyone was up in the air, exploring the forest from a new perspective. While the others were practicing what they had learned, Azil and Voda pulled Boden aside to tell him about Lazov. "What do you mean he tried to ban you?" Boden asked. Azil shrugged. "I guess he thought I was a bad influence or something. I think he was afraid everyone would find out about this." Voda motioned to the other infinidroids zooming through the forest. "Then our father realized I knew his secret as well." Boden's eyes grew wide. "Did he try to ban you too?" "No, but he was afraid I would tell everyone what we had learned, so he tried to stop me." "But that's not exactly what happened," said Azil, shaking her head. "What do you mean?" "Where is he?" "He slipped and fell off the branch we were standing on," Voda said. Boden's eyes grew wide. "He fell into the water." "Yes," said Voda, nodding softly. "He was swept away by the current." "Well, we need to help him," Boden said as he started to walk away. Voda grabbed him by the arm, pulling him back. "No, you can't." Boden turned and shouted at his sister. "What are you talking about?" "Our father needs my help." "Yes, he does need help, but you have more important things to do right now. Az and I know where he fell. We will find him." "But I should go with you," Boden said. "What could be more important than finding my father?" Voda stared up at her brother, her eyes growing wide. "Seriously, what about all the fids you left behind?" Azil moved closer to Boden. "Vo and I will find your father, but we need someone to lead the other more important rescue mission." She looked away from him toward the other infinidroids. "You need to lead this group back to save the others." Boden looked at the group, then turned back, shrugging. "Me? You want me to be a downer and boss these fits around?" Azil laughed. "That's one way," said Voda, smiling. "But I would recommend another way. Try guiding and encouraging them. Set an example through your actions, but above all, trust yourself. If you trust yourself, others will believe in you. Can you do that?" Boden's attitude appeared to change in front of them. He stood up tall, smiling at Voda. "Don't worry, sis, I got this." Chapter 24. A Father's Confession. Voda. "Down here," Azil yelled over the roaring floodwaters. She had been flying around near the surface of the water, while Voda flew above her for a broader view. "Do you see him?" asked Voda, shouting back. "I'm not sure. Look over there." Azil pointed to someone or something half submerged, attached to a small tree. Voda flew in for a closer look. "That's him. We need to pull him out of there." By this time he had noticed them and tried to wave his arms as he fought against the current. They both swooped down and hovered next to him. "We got you, Dad," Voda shouted. Azil and Voda each grabbed one of his arms and lifted him straight up out of the raging water. Lazov's body appeared, limp, as they carried him through the air. Above them, Azil spotted a thick growth branch. "Up there," she shouted. They slowly lowered Lazov onto the branch and landed gently beside him. Lazov appeared to be shocked by their new appearance. He first stared at Azil and then his daughter. You're both infinidroids," said Voda, staring at him intensely. "Yes, that." Lazov lowered his eyes and then cautiously looked at his daughter. "I guess you must know everything now, who we really are, and our original purpose, my centuries of lies." Voda frowned. "Yes, but why? Lies are one thing. What you've done, I know what I've done is worse." "Ya think?" said Voda, crossing her arms in disgust. "You've changed a society of purposeful and indestructible infinidroids and made them completely helpless." "You're right. But that was not my intention. Then what exactly was your intention?" asked Azil, blinking uncontrollably. "Well, that's kind of a long story." "Oh, we have time, lots and lots of time," Voda said with a smirk. Lazov sighed. "Thousands of years ago, when we were humans, we were so focused on our day-to-day survival that there was never enough time to just enjoy our lives. So I thought by eliminating school and work, there would be more time for fun." Voda tilted her head to one side. "I understand what work is, but what is school?" "It's where we go to learn every day, especially when we were young. I always considered school to be just another one of those unpleasant things we had to do." "Doesn't sound that bad to me," Azil said. "I guess my point is I wanted a society where everybody was always happy. And we were for a while. But I gradually began to notice after several generations of nothing but fun, the fun became less and less fun." Azil narrowed her eyes as she stared up at him. "That's because you stripped away the things that made each of us special with our own unique purpose. Your kind of fun, this fun without purpose, is shallow and fake." Voda nodded. "And it doesn't last." Lazov smiled at his daughter. "Come on, has your life really been that bad? It could have been better." "Everyone's could have," said Voda, looking away from her father. "I don't think you fully understand what you took from everyone." "I do. I wish I could go back and change things, but I can't." Voda swiftly turned toward Lazov and shouted at him. "You've had thousands of years to change things. What stopped you?" Lazov shrugged. "I don't know." Voda grinned at Azil. "Can you believe this? He doesn't know." She turned back toward her father, narrowing her eyes. "And the worst part of everything you've done, you've ripped everyone away from the most powerful part of themselves." "I don't understand." He looked to Azil, then back to Voda. "What part?" "Their Morval Grust. For all this time, all these years, you've kept everyone disconnected from the highest expression of their passion." "I know," said Lazov, lowering his head. "At first I didn't fully realize how important it was, and by the time I did, it was too late." "What do you mean, too late?" Voda asked. "Once everyone had forgotten the truth about Morval Grust and everything else, our society changed so much. I didn't know how to reverse what I had done." "You had all that time to come up with something, but couldn't think of a single solution?" Azil asked, shaking her head. Voda raised a finger. "Him I know. What about telling the truth?" "Ever thought of that?" Lazov grimaced. "There was that, but I didn't want to bring everyone down. So I just tried to make the most of the situation." Azil threw her arms up and stepped toward him. "The most? You call this the most? Maybe for yourself. Do you think living this lie has been easy for me, knowing all along that I alone am the reason we never fulfilled our destiny?" Lazov turned away from them. "Dad, you could have done something to make it better. You had options." "I know. Instead, I made everyone suffer with my lies. I've always thought everyone would have been better off without me around, and I believe that now more than ever." Voda grabbed her father's hand. "What are you saying?" He hesitantly looked into his daughter's eyes. "I don't belong here anymore. Once everyone knows the truth, they will all hate me for what I've done. I think it would be best if I went away and never came back." She dropped his hand. "Seriously, Dad, now that your secret is out, you'd rather run away and hide?" Lazov's eyes widened. "No, the last thing I want is to," Voda interrupted. You would really choose to leave everything and everyone you know behind just to avoid admitting what you've done. No, listen, this isn't about me trying to avoid accountability. I know I'm to blame. I also know I don't deserve to be a member of the society any longer, not with what I've done. Voda frowned. What about me? Do I not deserve a father? Yes, you deserve a good father. A father who is truthful. I have been lying to you and everyone else so long that I barely know what's true anymore. Then tell me, Voda pleaded. Why, in all these years, didn't you just tell the truth and admit what you'd done? Lozov turned and lowered his head in shame. I don't know, I guess I was afraid. Azil couldn't believe what she was hearing and wanted to interrupt, but decided that this discussion should be between Voda and her father. What is it? What were you so afraid of? Voda asked sincerely. Lozov lifted his head. I was afraid of this. This moment, when I would have to explain to my daughter why, for over 25,000 years, I've been lying to her. Voda stared at her father and tilted her head. What are you talking about? The lies I told you and everyone else, this isn't the first time. This isn't the first cycle you've heard my lies. Oh, I guess that makes sense, Voda said, squinting slightly. Lukas mentioned that we somehow come back after being nerfed. But what does it matter? I only remember this cycle. It does matter. Every cycle mattered. Lozov gently grabbed his daughter's hands and looked into her eyes. Because I remember them all, hundreds and hundreds of them. Voda's jaw dropped. You remember all those cycles? Yes, because you made them memorable. Me? Voda turned to Azil, then back to her father. I don't understand. What made all those cycles worth remembering is you. You've been my daughter every time. She stared at her father, wide-eyed. You've been my father for 25,000 years? Longer? I have watched nearly 1,000 different versions of you grow, and I have loved them all. I have watched you rediscover our world in so many ways. Every time I had lost my direction, you've always been my compass. When I've gotten frustrated, you've reminded me not to take everything so seriously. If I was ever bored, your curiosity would remind me that each day is a gift with something new to discover. There are many things I wish I could forget through all these years, but you never. A smile slowly crept onto her face. I never knew. All those years, Lozov nodded as he returned the smile. But why? You were the leader. You could have chosen anyone to be your daughter. Why did you choose me? Because I'm selfish, he replied with a grin. I wanted to be there by your side to witness, to see how your life would unfold each and every time. Lozov looked away for a moment, then returned his gaze to his daughter. Did Lukas tell you about our human origins? Azil watched as Voda struggled to recall the details. He told us a little, but I didn't really understand. Before all of this, when we were humans, you were my daughter, and I never wanted that to change. Voda hugged her father and then took a step back and smiled. Well, maybe it's time for a change. What do you mean? I've got an idea, but I need to talk to Lukas first. Lukas. I don't understand. Lozov smiled and began to nod. Oh, do you think you two might want to be my parents next time around? Voda grinned awkwardly. No, not. She paused, then shook her head. What? Where did that come from? Lozov appeared to be awkwardly embarrassed. I guess Lukas didn't tell you. Tell me what? There were some instances in previous cycles that I may have been slightly overprotective of you. In one of those particular situations a long time ago, I may have taken it a little too far, he said, squinting. Voda's jaw dropped. What? He was banished because of me? Well, Lozov said, shrugging. You may have had something to do with it, but it was really all my doing. I don't understand. Lukas told me you had him banished because he didn't agree with the direction you were taking everyone. For the first time in a long time, Azil noticed a genuinely kind smile appear on Lozov's face as he responded to his daughter. That may have been what I told him, but the truth is I just wanted to get that know-it all away from my daughter. Azil's eyes widened as she suddenly understood what Lozov had been saying. Back up. Voda and Lukas were a couple. Voda turned to Azil. Come on. A's catch up. I think you missed the important part. The part where Lukas has been under the impression for thousands of years that the main reason my dad had him banished was because he didn't agree with my father's vision. When the truth was, Voda turned to her father. What was it, Dad? Why didn't you approve of Lukas and I? I told you, Lozov said, smiling. I didn't like his attitude. He was a know-it-all. Azil said, shrugging. Isn't that kind of his thing? I mean, he is the historian. That's true. Voda turned to her father. What was the real problem you had with us being together? Lozov rubbed his chin for a moment. Honestly, I can't remember exactly. I was probably just having one of my overprotective moments. I bet you were so mean to poor Lucas, Voda said, grinning. I'm sure I was. And you two had been together forever. Forever? Just about nearly every cycle you two would find one another. Of course, because of his immortality, he never forgot his feelings for you. He just waited patiently for you to rediscover how you felt about him. And you always did. I'm confused, said Voda, shaking her head. How long ago was all this? A long, long time ago. Very long, before we moved to the swamp. Azil shrugged. Where were we before coming here? Several places. But in the beginning, we lived in the desert. That's where we originally rebuilt our civilization. The desert, what's that? Voda asked. It's nothing like the swamp, said Lazov, smiling. It's very dry and sandy with the sun always shining. Voda crossed her arms as she looked up at her father. Always sun, huh? That sure is interesting. Azil looked up into the green haze. And you took us to this place where there's never sun. Let me guess, Voda said. Narrowing her eyes, there was some important reason we were living in the desert in the first place. And there was some selfish reason you wanted us to move here. She tilted her head back and looked up into the trees. Next, she pressed a button on her wrist that shot a 4-pronged claw, attached to a steel cable over a tree branch. Instantly, her body launched straight up into the air. In the blink of an eye, she sat with her feet dangling from the branch high above them. Hey, Aze, Voda shouted. Why do you think he would have wanted us to leave the sun-filled desert? Azil shrugged as she looked up at her. I have absolutely no idea. Maybe it has something to do with this. A blue flame blazed from her fingertip. Or this. A loud screech filled the forest momentarily as she revved up the saw in her other hand. Lazov grinned and threw his arms into the air. You got me. Yeah, we kind of figured it out, said Azil, nodding. Voda swooped back down, landing in front of her. Lazov lowered his head. It was kind of screwed up, wasn't it? Screwed up? Voda laughed. You could say that. He looked at both of them, grimacing. You two must think I'm horrible. Pretty much, mumbled Azil, turning away. I don't think you're horrible, said Voda, shaking her head. Then she nodded. But you did do some horrible things. And I am truly sorry for everything what I did to both of you and everyone else. Voda smiled. I think I may be able to forgive you. But the others? I don't know, said Azil, shaking her head. What you've done, they're not going to like it. Lazov's eyes widened as he listened. That's true. The others may not be as forgiving as we've been. Voda paused, then shrugged. You sure you want to stick around? It might get ugly. I'm not going to hide from what I've done. Whatever happens, I deserve it. So you'll stay around? Voda asked. He smiled. If the others let me and if you can tolerate me. On 2 conditions, Voda said. 1, no more lies. Lazov held up his right hand. I promise. What's the second condition? We can't have you as our leader anymore, said Voda, shaking her head. Not with all you've done. He nodded. I agree. My leadership style may have worked for Fids, but the Infinidroids are going to need someone better, someone who's caring and trustworthy. That's for sure, Azil said with a grin. Lazov put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. I think you or your brother would make a great leader. The village needs some fresh new ideas. Aren't you forgetting something? Azil said. That's right, the village. Lazov turned to Azil. Well, maybe somebody should design and build us a new one. Azil stepped back and looked up at him in disbelief. Who, me? Who else? Lazov replied. I know I've been mean to you recently, but I have secretly admired your passion and determination throughout every one of your cycles. I had also feared that you, more than anyone else, might discover my secret. Looks like I had reason to be concerned. I'm just curious about a couple things, said Azil, tilting her head. Was all of it your idea? The Great Glow? The norphoonication process. Did you make it all up yourself? Lazov looked down with a smile, then back to her. Not exactly. Do you want to know another little secret? Azil was unsure and nodded reluctantly. Some of it, he said. Actually, most of it came from you. Her jaw dropped as she stared at Lazov blankly. Me. What? How? Azil, you have always had that creative spark, more than anyone I've ever met. In many ways, your ideas have been the only thing keeping things fresh and interesting around the swamp for thousands of years. Most of my big ideas came from your creative endeavors over many cycles. She shrugged. You mean you were inspired by some of my inventions, not just your inventions? Your drawings, your stories, your sculptures, your music, Azil's eyes grew wide. I make music? Oh yes, you've dedicated entire cycles to making music and I loved it. With every cycle, you had more wonderful ideas to share. Some of these ideas I didn't want to forget, so I weaved them into my creation. Lazov slowly shook his head. This enormous, ridiculous mythology. It wasn't all that bad, Voda said, patting her father on the back. Yes, it was. Azil said half-jokingly. Dad, there's one thing you never told us about yourself. What do you want to know? Before all of this, Voda grinned. Before you became our lying leader, what did you do? What did I do? Lazov crossed his arms and thought for a moment. Let's see, I stole ideas to make up crazy things and fantasy worlds. No, I mean, what was your original role within our society? That was my original role. I was a writer. A writer? Asked Azil, shrugging. Writers make things up? They lie? He laughed. Kind of. But really they just try to tell stories that others find interesting. Dad, what else haven't you told us? Lazov stared at her for a moment. Are you sure you want to know? Azil laughed. Yes, tell us, we want a full confession. Okay, this may take a while, he said, smiling. Voda stepped closer and put a hand on her father's back. Can you give us the condensed version? 44,000 years seems like a really long time. No kidding, Azil said. I'll try to keep it short, but I can't make any guarantees. Azil and Voda leaned in to listen. Through the rest of that day and the entire night, Lazov let it all out, his motivations, his plans and his lies. Standing there, he awkwardly told them about his many selfish deeds, sinister plots and poor choices, while simultaneously releasing some of his own enormous burden, a product of thousands of years of lies. Chapter 25. Elvo. All 77 infinidroids gathered at the heart of the village in their new home up in the trees. Their new village resembled a network of steel spider webs, which created pathways and structures that spread throughout the forest. Their houses were no longer down on the ground, but up high in the branches of the towering growths. It was now nearly 1 year after the terrible flood that had washed away everything they once knew. In that time, everyone in their society had slowly grown to understand where they came from and who they truly were. This understanding had sparked a complete shift in both the attitudes and behaviors of everyone in the village. They were now more open to some of the unfamiliar topics they once feared. By choosing to be curious, rather than fearful, they could now view their world in a more positive way. Each of the infinidroids allowed their own curiosity to pull them in whatever unique direction they desired. Because of this, many had begun to express themselves through art, music, fashion, performance, and a multitude of other ways. The reconnection with their true history gave everyone a much broader perspective than what they previously had. All the infinidroids now understood that their world wasn't simply a flat swamp, but an enormous round planet. They also learned about fascinating ideas, inventions and cultures of the billions of humans who once populated its surface. These discoveries gave all of them a more thorough understanding of what was possible, inspiring new ways of thinking and being. Now, through the full activation of their Morval Grust, each of them had become aware of their own true passion, as well as the specific abilities that went with it. This knowledge empowered every infinidroid to live a more fulfilling life. Each of them now understood how their own unique skills could contribute to the benefit of the entire society. This new perspective also gave them a greater sense of belonging and pride. Many of their previous modes of behavior had been transformed or abandoned completely. A genuine understanding of fun, grounded in individual and collective purpose, had nearly replaced the inauthentic attitude of unconventional. Recently, everyone had been curious about the fate of the big annual event. Some of them wondered if they should do anything or just let it slip into oblivion like much of their recent history. Its fate had remained a mystery, a surprise which on that day was finally revealed. This new event, the first annual celebration of the Infinidroid Nation, had replaced the Festival of the Great Glow. In many ways it resembled the previous event, but this new celebration focused specifically on the topic of rebirth, not just for those beginning new cycles, but for the complete metamorphosis of their entire society. There had been many changes over the previous year, but Azil knew none of them could compare to what she was experiencing on that day. Earlier that morning, as part of the event, Azil finally became a big. But more importantly, she was now the mother of a spirited little girl named Baravas. Azil smiled as she watched her tiny daughter proudly wearing the necklace she once made for her father. To her, Bara symbolized the bold and vibrant new attitude within the society. As great as that made Azil feel, she knew there was much more to her new daughter. Bara held a secret one that she herself would never know. Within Bara's small metal body sat a Morval core, which was highly significant to Azil. It was the same core her mother had carried for 36 years. Azil truly missed her mother and felt a sense of comfort knowing the affection she could continue as she raised her child. She's so cute, Voda said, watching Barra playing with the other noobs. Azil smiled. Yeah, I'm really lucky to have her. I'm glad we no longer use that crazy wheel, or I may have gotten stuck with. Voda's eyes widened. Don't you say A's? They both looked down at Voda's son, who was having fun with two Wanzolu pobs. Elvo be nice, Voda said, smiling. Nubbly's head is not a drum. She turned back to Azil and shrugged. Elvo may be a handful now, but I have a feeling that kid has a lot of potential. Potential, ha. As Azil and Voda stood there and observed Bara, Elvo, Jersa, Nubbly and the other noobs who would soon see the future of their society, Lucas frantically ran up to them. Though it's time, they need you on stage. All right, you two, wish me luck, Voda said with a nervous smile. Azil gave her a big hug. You'll do fine. Fine? Lucas said, you'll do great. Look around. All these infinidroids love you. He threw his arms around her and whispered in her ear. But not as much as I do. I heard that, said Azil, grinning. Voda started toward the stage, then turned back to Lucas. Oh, make sure Elvo doesn't do anything too crazy while I'm gone. The three of them looked down to see that Elvo had ripped apart several pobs and was tossing the fluffy insides into the breeze. Lucas shook his head and looked up at Voda. I'll try, but I can't make any guarantees. As Voda left to join Bowden on stage, Azil took a moment to reflect upon the previous year. She couldn't believe how much progress they had made in such a short amount of time. What she saw as she looked around the village filled her with optimism about their future. There were infinidroids flying, dancing, creating, performing, and everything in between. Thanks to Lucas, everyone had rediscovered some of the old ways in which they could express their individualities. Whether it was through the clothes, jewelry, and accessories they put on, or the decorative body art they displayed, everyone was able to exhibit their own unique style. Experimentation with some of the old ways of making fabrics and dyes had allowed them to express themselves through bright and colorful clothing. Over the past year, as they discovered new and exciting ways of decorating their bodies, their preoccupation with buffing had gradually declined. Standing there, in front of the new stage she designed, Azil gazed up in wonder as the main event unfolded before her eyes. It was a spectacular performance which creatively fused movement with sound and color. She glanced down at Barra and recognized that same look of wonder in her eyes as well. And they weren't the only ones. Everyone in the audience shared that same expression of amazement. There was something else Azil noticed as she scanned the faces in the crowd, something that was rare in their existence down in the swamp. She saw smiles, genuine smiles. Seeing this sincere display of joy made all her planning and effort over the previous year worth every moment. Later, as Voda addressed the crowd, a sense of pride washed over Azil like never before. The girl she had grown up with was now not only a big, Voda along with her brother were the official new co-leaders of the Infinidroid Nation. Azil stood next to Lucas as they watched Voda. Lucas nudged Azil. She's amazing, isn't she? Yes, she is, and you better treat her right, if you know what's good for you, she said, nudging him back firmly. Not to be left out. Elvo Zal looked up and nudged Lucas. Yeah, man, I've got my eye on you. After addressing the audience, Voda stepped aside and Bowden began to speak. This day, this new village, none, if it would have been possible, if it wasn't for one curious and passionate woman. Thank you, Az, for your strength, courage, and your love. As the crowd focused their attention on Azil, her instinct was to feel embarrassment. But instead, as they began to cheer, something else happened. Azil Grage, in that miraculous moment, felt appreciated.